There is a version of The Simpsons most people never quite see. Not the bright yellow family on the couch, not the chalkboard gag, not the easy comfort of a 30-year-old sitcom looping in the background of someone's apartment while they fold laundry. Underneath all of that, sitting quietly behind 700 and something episodes, there is a long, strange conspiracy the show has been building for almost 40 years, and almost nobody actually explains it. They explain the predictions. They post the screenshots. They argue about the Apu episode. Nobody sits down and walks through the whole thing in one quiet pass. So tonight, that is what we are going to do. Slowly, carefully, with every loose thread we can actually verify. Get comfortable, turn the lights down. We are going to be here a while. And if you have not subscribed to Danuto, it really does help us keep making these. The story of the Simpsons conspiracy does not start with a prediction. It starts much earlier than that, in a place almost everyone forgets. In 1987, the family was not a family yet. They were a set of crude, scratchy little drawings shown between sketches on a Sunday evening variety show called The Tracey Ullman Show on a network, Fox, that had only just begun to exist. The shorts were brief, sometimes a minute, sometimes two. Homer was angrier and more inarticulate. Bart was a small chaos demon with a different voice. Marge looked like a stack of disheveled blue hair sitting on top of a long, thin neck. And Lisa, strangely, was almost interchangeable with Bart in those earliest pieces, a second prankster, rather than the serious moral center she would later become. The shorts were created by a cartoonist named Matt Groening, who, according to the much-repeated origin story, sketched the family in a few minutes in the lobby of a producer's office because he did not want to sign away the rights to a comic strip he had spent years building. Whether that exact lobby story is the literal truth or a slightly polished version of it depends on which interview you read. What is documented is that those shorts ran for roughly 2 years and 48 of them aired before the family graduated in December of 1989 to a half-hour Christmas special called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. That first proper episode is the door everything else walks through. And from the first second of it, the show was already not quite the show people. Now remember, here is the first quiet detail nobody talks about. The Simpsons did not start as a comedy in the way a sitcom starts as a comedy. The opening episode is, on its surface, a story about a man who cannot afford Christmas, who gambles his last money on a losing greyhound and ends up bringing home that same greyhound because no one else will. It is sweet, but it is also openly sad, openly about poverty, openly about a father failing the people he loves and being rescued only by accident. The pilot is, structurally, closer to a melancholy short film than to a punchline machine. That tone is the bedrock under everything that came afterwards. You can read almost every later mystery, every later theory, every later argument about whether the show has lost itself as an argument about how far it has drifted from that one quiet, almost tender opening. People who think the show is a cynical machine and people who think it is the softest thing on television are both, in a way, right. The show has been balancing those two registers since the first episode and has never quite stopped wobbling between them. Let us start with the largest conspiracy of all, the one that has eaten every other Simpsons story in the public mind. The idea that the show can see the future. You have seen the screenshots. You have seen the threads. You have heard people with a kind of low panic in their voice telling you that The Simpsons predicted Donald Trump, predicted September 11th, predicted the Disney buyout of 20th Century Fox, predicted the coronavirus pandemic, predicted the death of various famous people, predicted the Greek debt crisis, predicted the Murdoch family drama, predicted the Higgs boson, and on and on. The list expands every few weeks. Whenever something strange happens in the real world, a new clip surfaces, sometimes from a real episode, sometimes from an episode that does not exist, and is presented as proof that the show has access to something the rest of us do not. The strong form of the conspiracy is that the writers either know the future or have been told the future or are in some way connected to a hidden architecture that knows it and that they have been quietly broadcasting it for decades, hidden in plain sight in a yellow cartoon that almost nobody is taking seriously. Tonight is not the night where we tell you that. Tonight is the night where we actually go through it, calmly, and sort the genuine moments from the fakes. Because the strangest thing about the prediction conspiracy is that there are some real moments inside it. And once you pull those out from the haze of fabricated screenshots, the truth is more interesting than the myth, not less. Take the most famous one, the Trump prediction. The claim is that The Simpsons predicted Donald Trump would become president. The episode is real. It is called Bart to the Future, and it aired in March of the year 2000 in the 11th season on a Sunday night, written by Dan Groening. In it, Lisa, as an adult, has just become president, and she is dealing with a budget crunch she inherited from her predecessor, who is named in dialogue as President Trump. That much is true. There is no doctored image. There is no rumor. There is a real episode of The Simpsons in which a future President Trump is mentioned by name, 16 years before the real Trump won the real election. The interesting part is what the joke actually is. In interviews afterwards, the writer described the line as, in essence, a warning. A joke about the absurdity of a celebrity reality television figure ever reaching the office, and the punchline of the surrounding bit is that the country he leaves behind is bankrupt and exhausted. The show was not predicting a Trump presidency in any mystical sense. It was naming a public figure who had been openly flirting with running for years by then, and using him as shorthand for a particular kind of absurdity. That is the difference between prophecy and satire. Satire takes a current absurdity and pushes it one click further into the future to make the absurdity visible. When the future then accidentally catches up, it can look like prophecy. It is not. It is satire whose target turned out to be larger than anyone expected. That is the pattern under almost every real prediction. Take the Disney one. There is an episode from 1998 called When You Dish Upon a Star, in which a billboard in the background reads that 20th Century Fox is a division of the Walt Disney Company. The episode aired in season 10. The actual acquisition happened, in legal terms, in 2019. The joke ran for over 20 years before reality caught up with it. But in 1998, the joke was already obvious to anyone working inside the industry. Disney had been quietly buying up media properties for years. Fox was already openly worried about its own independence. A throwaway sight gag on a billboard was the writers nudging an industry concern just one frame into the future. When it eventually happened, the show looked omniscient. It was not. It was paying attention. The same can be said of the so-called horse meat gag, where, by most accounts, a school cafeteria scene from the mid-1990s featured a lunch lady scooping suspect meat from an unmarked drum years before the European horse meat scandal of 2013. The same can be said of the smartwatch joke in a future segment from 1995, where an adult character speaks into a wristwatch as casually as people now speak into phones. The same can be said of the autocorrect joke in an early scene with Bart and his classmates, where a tablet device misinterprets a child's voice command in a way that ruins his message. Those are real moments in real episodes. None of them are prophecy. All of them are writers in a room in the 1990s looking at trends that were already starting and writing them slightly ahead of where the public was. Then, on the other side of the line, there are the fakes. And there are a lot of fakes. The most viral one, for years, was a supposed screenshot of an episode in which Tom Hanks announces he has contracted Ebola, which circulated heavily around 2014 alongside a real Ebola outbreak in West Africa. That image is fabricated. No episode of The Simpsons has ever shown Tom Hanks announcing he has Ebola. Tom Hanks did appear in the Simpsons movie in 2007 in a brief cameo as a celebrity spokesperson for an unrelated government program. The Ebola line was edited in by a fan years later, and then taken seriously by people who did not check. The same is true of the supposed coronavirus prediction, where doctored images circulated in 2020 showing a news anchor reading the word coronavirus. The actual episode being referenced, Marge and Chains, aired in 1993 and concerns a fictional flu called the Osaka flu, spreading from imported juicers. The word coronavirus is not in the episode. The image with that word in it was added later by someone with a screenshot tool. Once you start checking, the pattern becomes clear. The big, specific, headline-grabbing predictions, the ones that name a disease, or a celebrity, or an exact event, are almost always fabricated. The real predictions The documented ones are quieter, often visual, often background, and almost always about trends already visible in the world when the joke was written. This matters because it is the center of the larger conspiracy. The myth that The Simpsons can see the future is a myth built almost entirely on social media. It thrives because the show has been on the air for so long and produced so many episodes that for almost any event you can find some background detail somewhere that resembles it. It thrives because the writers, in their best years, were unusually well-read, unusually well-networked, and unusually willing to write industry insider jokes and political jokes that came true precisely because they were targeting things that were already in motion. And it thrives because, in the absence of a single coherent answer, the human mind reaches for one, and prophecy is a cleaner answer than coincidence. Prophecy is more comforting than the much sadder real explanation, which is that a lot of the world's worst events were predictable, were obviously coming, and were openly joked about by people who had been watching the early signs for years. So the first piece of the conspiracy is that there is no prophecy. The second piece, and this is where it gets stranger, is that the show is in on the myth. By the 2010s, the writers had noticed what was happening online, and they began deliberately seeding gags that looked like predictions, in part as an in-joke, in part as commentary. By most accounts, a later season episode has openly acknowledged the prediction theory and played with it directly. Whether you read that as the show admitting the joke or doubling down on the myth depends on your taste. The result is a strange feedback loop. The internet treats every old episode like a prophecy. The show begins writing new episodes that play with that treatment. The internet then treats those new episodes as further evidence of the prophecy, and the conspiracy feeds itself. It is the most modern kind of conspiracy theory, one in which the supposed prophet is openly winking at the camera, and the audience continues to receive the wink as further proof. There is one more layer to this, and it is the layer that gets the least attention. The Simpsons prediction myth is, in a strange way, the thing that has kept the show in the cultural conversation in years when, on its own merits, it might have faded. The writers know that, the network knows that. By the late 2010s, the official Simpsons social media accounts were openly joking about predictions, posting old clips next to new headlines, and inviting the engagement. From a business perspective, a show that can be summoned back to the front page every time something strange happens in the world has a kind of immortality almost no other show has earned. The Simpsons did not predict its own immortality, but once it noticed it had stumbled into a way of staying immortal, it leaned in. That is not magic. That is media strategy. And it is the first piece of the larger conspiracy you have to understand before any of the rest of it makes sense. Now let us turn to the second piece, which is the one almost nobody walks through carefully, even though it is the easiest to verify if you slow down. The geography conspiracy. Where exactly is Springfield? For 30 plus years, the show has refused to answer this. The town the Simpsons live in is one of the most documented towns in American television, with its own nuclear power plant, its own school system, its own elementary school principal whose history we will get to in a moment, its own retirement castle, its own monorail, its own escalator to nowhere, and 100 recurring side characters whose lives are tracked across hundreds of episodes. And yet, despite all of that, the writers have spent decades refusing to say what state it is in. The standard joke, repeated again and again, is that every time a character is about to name the state, something happens to interrupt them. A plane flies overhead, a train passes, a character coughs, the line is bleeped, the camera cuts away. It is a joke, but it is also a discipline, and it has been observed so consistently that there must be a reason. The official reason, given in interviews by Matt Groening and others over the years, is that Springfield is supposed to be everywhere and nowhere. The name itself was chosen partly because it is one of the most common town names in the United States, and partly, as Groening has said, as a small wink to the classic sitcom Father Knows Best, which was set in a fictional Springfield. The idea was that every viewer, wherever they lived, could imagine that this Springfield was the one closest to them, and that the Simpsons family was, in some quiet way, their neighbors. That is the official line, and it is probably true. But the show has also, over 30 plus seasons, dropped enough contradictory clues that the question of where Springfield actually is has become its own running mystery, and the fans who have tried to map it have produced some of the more obsessive cartography in television history. Inside the show, Springfield touches the Pacific Ocean in some episodes and inland prairies in others. It is near a desert in one season and at the foot of a mountain range in another. It contains a tire yard fire that has been burning since the show began, a famously contaminated lake, a state penitentiary, a national park, a chocolate factory, an upstate region, a coastline, a tomato farming community, and a railway connection to almost everywhere. It is bordered, at various points, by towns named Shelbyville, Capital City, Ogdenville, North Haverbrook, Brockway, and a dozen others, none of which exist in real geography. It has, in one episode, been said to be in the same state as a real city, in another episode been said to be 5 states away from that same city, and in a third episode been said to be reachable only by a long train ride from a location that places it on the other side of the country entirely. Every season, the geography contradicts the season before. The town floats. Matt Groening, in an interview in 2012, said that the Springfield in his head was, originally, Springfield, Oregon, the town near Portland where he grew up. That comment was widely reported as the answer. It is not the answer the show has used. Inside the show, the writers have continued to keep the location a moving target, and Groening himself has, in later interviews, walked the comment back, suggesting he meant only that the name had been borrowed from his hometown, not that the in-show Springfield was meant to be there. So, even though there is now a quote from the creator naming Oregon, the show itself has never confirmed it, and the cartoonists, the writers, and the showrunners have all spent decades carefully maintaining the joke. The town remains, officially, unplaceable. The conspiracy, in its quieter form, is that this is not just a joke. It is an engineering decision made very early that has shaped the entire structure of the show. By refusing to locate the town, the writers gave themselves permission to do anything in it. Springfield can have an opera house and a dirt road on the same block. It can have a beach and a ski resort. It can host a presidential primary and a small town parade. It can be the second largest city in its state in one episode and a forgotten village in another. The town is not a town. It is a stage on which any story can be set, and the joke about the interrupted name is not a joke about geography. It is a joke about the writers protecting their own freedom. Once you understand that, you understand why every fan theory that tries to map Springfield onto a real state will always fail. It was not designed to be mapped. It was designed to be everywhere a viewer needs it to be. And that flexibility is part of why the show outlived almost every other sitcom of its generation. There is, however, a much darker reading of the Springfield mystery, and it is the one the show itself has occasionally hinted at. If Springfield is unplaceable, then so are its disasters. The town has been destroyed in various episodes by floods, by fires, by giant lizards, by alien invasion, by nuclear meltdown, by tornado, by mob violence, by a sinkhole that swallowed an entire neighborhood. It has been evacuated, it has been quarantined, it has been sealed inside a glass dome by the federal government, it has had its leaders arrested, its police force corrupted, its children kidnapped, its power plant repeatedly almost detonated. If you list every catastrophic event in Springfield as if the show were a single connected history, you end up with a town that should not still exist. The interpretation some long-term fans have arrived at, and it is an interpretation, not a fact, is that Springfield is something like a dream space, a place where consequences cannot land, a place where the worst can happen and the next week everything is fine. That reading turns the geography joke into something stranger. The town is unplaceable not just because the writers want flexibility, but because the town is, in some metaphysical way, not quite a real place at all. We are reading into it. The show does not literally say any of that, but the show does, repeatedly, build episodes around the idea that Springfield is a kind of trap. Characters who try to leave often come back. Characters who try to change something fundamental are nudged, often by the script itself, back into their original shape. The interpretation lives in that pattern. The fact lives only in the running gag. Both are interesting. Both are worth holding in mind as we move forward, because the next part of the conspiracy is the one that turns this metaphysical trap into something almost human. The trap, in its clearest form, is the question of why nobody on The Simpsons ever ages. We can talk about this as a production fact and as an in-show puzzle, and the gap between the two is where the conspiracy lives. As a production fact, it is simple. The Simpsons is an animated show. The voice actors age. The drawings do not. Bart has been 10 years old since 1989. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been a baby. Homer and Marge have been somewhere in their mid-30s, give or take, for over 3 decades. The characters do not age because the show is structurally designed not to age them, in the same way that the characters in any long-running animated sitcom are not aged. Aging them would lock the writers into a single direction and eventually end the show. That is the production answer, and it is correct. In show, however, the writers have been remarkably specific about establishing a real timeline. Episodes have included flashbacks to Homer and Marge meeting in high school in the 1970s. Other episodes have set the same meeting in the 1990s. There are flashbacks to Bart's birth in the late 70s, and to Bart's birth in the early 90s, and to Bart's birth at various points in between. The same is true for every other family member. The flashbacks have shifted forward over the decades, decade by decade, so that the characters can always seem to be the same age relative to the present. This is sometimes called the sliding timescale, and almost every long-running cartoon uses it. The Simpsons, because it has been on the air so long, uses it more aggressively than almost any other show in the medium. Whole episodes of canonical backstory have been quietly rewritten by later episodes that simply ignore the previous version. Homer was a teenager in the mid-70s in one episode and a teenager in the early 90s in another. Marge's family was working class in one decade and middle class in another. The town's history shifts every time the writers need to make a joke land. The fan theory, and this is purely a theory, is that the family is trapped, not just in the production sense, but in a kind of in-universe loop. The family is unable to age, unable to escape Springfield, unable to permanently change anything, because the universe they live in is structurally a loop. Each episode resets, each disaster heals. Each tragedy is forgotten by the next Sunday. The theory has been expressed in many forms, sometimes as a Groundhog Day reading, sometimes as a purgatory reading, sometimes as a much darker reading where the family is in some kind of liminal afterlife and the loop is their condition. None of those readings are confirmed by the show. The show is a sitcom. It resets because sitcoms reset. The interpretation is the audience's, but the show has, in certain episodes, played with it. There is, for example, the episode in which Homer briefly steps outside the show's own dimension, into a 3-dimensional space, and looks back at himself as a cartoon. There's the episode in which the family meet other animated versions of themselves and have to negotiate a kind of multiverse. There is the episode in which Bart and Lisa, in a future segment, look back at their own childhoods and remember events that contradict the very episodes we have already seen. The show is aware of its own structure, and it occasionally invites the audience to be aware of it too. Whether that awareness is a wink or a confession depends, again, on which lens you bring. The next layer of the conspiracy, and we are going to slow down for this one because it is the most interesting one in the whole architecture, is the question of Homer Simpson. Not Homer as a character, Homer as a force. The argument, which has been made in different forms by different fans over the years, is that Homer Simpson is, in the internal logic of the show, something more than a man. He survives things that should kill him. He encounters things no human should encounter. He bounces back from injuries that would put any ordinary person in the hospital for life. He has been into outer space, into the depths of the ocean, into mythological realms, into time itself. He has met every president of the United States from the era he lived through, has performed on stage with multiple iconic musicians, has worked in dozens of completely incompatible careers, and has died several times only to come back in the next scene. As far as fans have pieced together, in one episode he has briefly been transformed into a god by mistake. None of this, in any other show, would be possible. In The Simpsons, It happens often enough that some viewers have stopped reading it as comedy and started reading it as cosmology. The episode that crystallized this reading was a season 8 episode called Homer's Enemy, which aired in the spring of 1997, written by John Swartzwelder. In the episode, a new character named Frank Grimes is introduced. He is, in almost every way, the audience's surrogate inside the show. He is a hard-working, deeply ordinary man who has clawed his way up from nothing by sheer effort, and he arrives at the Springfield nuclear power plant, fully expecting that ability and discipline will be rewarded. Then he meets Homer. Frank Grimes watches Homer eat a sandwich that was found on the floor. He watches Homer take credit for accidents. He watches Homer survive what should have been a fatal industrial accident with barely a scratch. He watches Homer get praised for an obviously sloppy nuclear plant model that he submits to a children's competition. He watches Homer, in short, prosper without effort. And he watches the universe, the writers, the laws of cause and effect bend repeatedly around Homer to protect him from any consequence. Frank Grimes loses his mind. He shouts at Homer, he tries to expose Homer, and in the end, he dies in an industrial accident that he himself causes while in the middle of an attempt to prove that Homer is a fraud. The funeral is held. Homer falls asleep during it. The other characters laugh at him, laughing in his sleep. The credits roll. End of episode. That episode, more than almost any other, has become the center of a long-running fan theory about the show. The theory, sometimes called the cosmic horror reading of The Simpsons, is that Homer is not a man in the normal sense. He is something else, a reality bender, a walking exception to the laws of cause and effect. Frank Grimes was the first character to notice it, and he was destroyed by the noticing. Everyone else in Springfield has, by now, learned not to notice it, because noticing it is what killed Grimes. This is, again, an interpretation. The show does not say it. The writers, when asked, have given much more grounded readings of the episode, most of them saying it was an experiment in introducing a real-world man into a cartoon universe in order to expose how the cartoon universe actually works. That was the joke, and the joke was deliberately bleak. But the interpretation has outlived the writer's original intention, because the show has, in episodes since, leaned back into it. Homer has continued to survive things. The town has continued to bend around him. Whenever the show needs Homer to live, Homer lives. Whenever the show needs the world to behave normally, it behaves normally. The two registers cannot quite be reconciled. Homer is both a fool and a kind of small local god, and the show has never fully chosen between them. And that unresolved tension is part of what makes the show feel haunted. If you want a single image to hold in mind for this part of the conspiracy, hold the one where Homer is sitting in the front pew at Frank Grimes' funeral, asleep, calling out to a beer he is dreaming about, while the entire mourning crowd laughs at him because he is asleep at a funeral. The man who was destroyed by trying to understand Homer is being buried, and Homer is asleep at the funeral, and everyone is laughing. The show ends on that beat. Whatever you think the show is, that ending is not the ending of a normal comedy. It is closer to the ending of a myth in which the mortal who challenges the god is punished, and the god, oblivious, sleeps through the consequences. The reading is interpretation. The funeral is fact. The combination is the conspiracy. There is one more episode that belongs in this thread, and the show has spent decades not knowing what to do with it. It is the episode in which the writers retcon the entire identity of Principal Seymour Skinner. It aired in September of 1997, early in season 9, and it is called The Principal and the Pauper, written by Ken Keeler. The premise is that, on the night of Skinner's birthday party, a stranger arrives at the school and announces that he, not the man we have known as Principal Skinner for the last 8 years of television, is the real Seymour Skinner. The man who has been calling himself Seymour Skinner is, it turns out, a man named Armin Tamzarian, who took the real Skinner's identity after the real Skinner was reported missing in action during the Vietnam War. The fake Skinner, our Skinner, the man who has built an entire life as the principal of Springfield Elementary, confesses, and Springfield, after some hesitation, accepts the real Skinner. Then, in the final 2 minutes of the episode, Springfield decides that the real Skinner is annoying, the imposter Skinner is the one they actually like, and a judge issues a ruling that the imposter is, from this moment on, legally Seymour Skinner, that nobody is to mention the change ever again, and that the real Skinner is to be run out of town on a rail. The episode ends. The show never refers to the real Skinner again. That episode was, at the time, one of the most controversial episodes in the history of The Simpsons. Fans hated it. The writing staff was divided on it. Matt Groening himself, in interviews afterwards, said he disliked it. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, has said in commentary that he found the premise insulting to a beloved character. The episode is widely considered the moment at which the show first openly admitted that it could rewrite its own canon, that no character was permanently who they appeared to be, that everything was, in the end, made up. The episode has never been retconned. It is still part of the official record. Skinner is, technically, still Armin Tamzarian. The show simply chose, by judicial decree, inside the episode itself, to never mention it again. That is a remarkable piece of television writing. It is the show telling its audience openly that it is going to keep doing whatever it wants, that the rules do not bind it, and that if you do not like it, you should stop watching. Many people did. Many people did not. The show went on for another 25 plus years. The conspiracy reading of the principal and the pauper is not that the writers made a mistake. It is that the writers, in that episode, accidentally told the audience the truth about the entire show. Every character on The Simpsons is, in some sense, a mask. Every backstory can be replaced. Every history can be rewritten. The town is not located anywhere. The years do not pass. The dead come back. The retcons accumulate. The show is, in the strict sense, not a continuous narrative at all. It is a long, ongoing performance, in which the only rule is that the performance must continue. The principal and the pauper is the moment at which the show admitted that out loud, and the audience, in protest, looked away. The show kept going. It is still going. And every Skinner episode since has been, technically, an episode about Armin Tamzarian. The audience has chosen not to remember. The show has chosen not to remind them, which is, in its own quiet way, the perfect metaphor for what The Simpsons does to its own past. We will come back to that idea, because it threads through everything. But before we do, there is another thread that has to be pulled, and it is the one that gets the most heated reactions from fans even now. It is the question of the banned episodes. The episodes the show, or its owners, or its broadcasters, have removed from circulation, hidden in regional libraries only, or quietly stopped showing in syndication. There are not many, but each one is a piece of the conspiracy in its own way, because each one tells you something about what the show is allowed to keep and what it is not. The most famous one is the episode called Stark Raving Dad. It is the opening episode of season 3. It aired on the 19th of September, 1991. In it, Homer, accused of insanity at work because he comes home wearing a pink shirt by accident, is sent to a mental health institution where he meets a large white man who is convinced he is Michael Jackson. The man in the episode is voiced by what is officially credited as the pseudonym John J. Smith. By widespread reporting, that voice was Michael Jackson himself. The real Michael Jackson appeared on The Simpsons, anonymously, in 1991, for what was, at the time, an enormous coup for the show. The episode was a hit. It was rerun for years. It was included in syndication packages. It was on the complete season 3 DVD release. It was, for almost 3 decades, just a part of the show. Then, in 2019, after the release of a documentary called Leaving Neverland, which centered on serious allegations of child sexual abuse against Jackson, the producers and executive team made the decision to pull Stark Raving Dad from all official circulation. They did not edit Jackson's voice out. They pulled the entire episode. It was removed from syndication. It was removed from streaming. It was removed from the DVD reissues. It is, as far as fans have tracked, still unavailable on the official platforms. The producers said publicly that the decision was made because they felt the episode could no longer be watched without those allegations in mind, and they did not want to keep profiting from Jackson's contribution. That is the public story, and it is the verifiable story. The conspiracy reading attached to it has nothing to do with whether the decision was right. It has to do with what the decision implies about the show. Because once you can pull an episode, you can pull any episode. Once you decide that one historical guest star's presence has become unacceptable, you have set a precedent that other historical guest stars, of which there are hundreds, could be subject to the same standard. The show has not, to date, pulled any other episode for the same reason, but the door is now open, and every time a former guest star is involved in a public scandal, the question is asked. So far, the answer has been no. But the existence of Stark Raving Dad sitting in a vault, removed from the official history, is itself a quiet conspiracy. The episode existed. It was widely watched. The show has now chosen to act as if it did not happen. That is the same logic by which Skinner remains Skinner. The show has the power to erase, and it will use the power when it has to. There are other episodes that have been quietly handled. There is the episode called The City of New York versus Homer Simpson, in which Homer's car is impounded in a parking lot directly under the World Trade Center. The episode aired in 1997. After September 11th, 2001, it was pulled from syndication for several years out of sensitivity. It was eventually returned to circulation with no edits and is currently available. There is the episode called Trilogy of Error, which aired in 2001 and includes a fireworks gag that some affiliates handled cautiously in the years right after September 11th. There is the episode called Blame It on Lisa, in which Lisa and her family travel to Brazil and encounter a series of dangers and stereotypes the Brazilian government formally objected to in 2002. The episode was never pulled, but the producers and the network issued a public statement of regret and clarified the episode was intended as fictional satire. There is, as well, the long-discussed moment in an early episode in which a yellow joke is told in a way that, in retrospect, the producers themselves have said they would not write today. That moment has been quietly excised from some streaming versions and is still present in others. None of these are conspiracies in the strong sense. None of them is hidden in a vault. None of them involves a secret cabal. What they involve is something subtler. A show that has been on the air long enough that its own history now includes material the show, in its current form, does not want to claim. That is true of every long-running cultural product. The Simpsons is unusual only because the gap between the early seasons and the current seasons is so wide and so well documented that the show has had to make the editorial choices in public in a way almost no other television series has had to. The most painful of these editorial choices, and the one that has gotten the most thoughtful treatment in the public conversation, is the choice the show eventually made about Apu Nahasapi Mapatilon. Apu is one of the longest running side characters on the show. He is the operator of the Quickie Mart, a convenience store in Springfield. He is voiced, from his first appearance, by Hank Azaria, a white American actor, performing in an accented voice that the show used as part of its general practice of having a small number of voice actors play a very large number of recurring characters. Apu's character is, in the strict show internal sense, a sympathetic one. He is hardworking, he is intelligent, he is loyal to his family, to his religion, to his community. He gets serious story arcs about his arranged marriage, his children, his immigration status, and his relationship to his faith. He is, by the standards of his decade of television, one of the more developed South Asian characters on American primetime. And that is part of what made him beloved by many viewers, including many South Asian viewers for many years. But the voice, performed by Azaria, was always understood by many of those same viewers as a caricature. The accent was broad, the cadence was specific. The character, despite his depth, became, in popular culture, a single line that school children would imitate at one another, and that imitation often felt, to the people on the receiving end of it, like mockery. In 2017, the comedian Hari Kondabalu released a documentary called The Problem with Apu, in which he interviewed a series of South Asian actors and writers about what it had been like to grow up with Apu as the only nationally known South Asian voice on American television. Several of the people he interviewed described, in detail, the experience of being shouted Apu's catchphrase at them in playgrounds. Several of them described how hard it had been to audition for roles without being asked by white casting directors to do the Apu voice. The documentary was widely watched. It was not the first time the issue had been raised in public, but it crystallized the issue in a way that the previous conversations had not. The show's first response, in an episode that aired in 2018, was awkward. The episode featured a moment in which Lisa Simpson, looking directly into the camera, said that something which had begun decades earlier with the best intentions and had been applauded and inoffensive was now considered politically incorrect, and that there was nothing to be done about it. The line was widely read, including by Kondabolu himself, as a deflection. The producers had, in effect, used Lisa as a mouthpiece to dismiss the criticism. The reaction was not what the show seems to have expected. There was outrage, and there was sadness, and the conversation about Apu, far from ending, intensified. Over the following 2 years, the show's position evolved. In 2020, Hank Azaria publicly announced that he would no longer voice Apu, and that he had come to believe the role should not be played by a white actor, and that he was personally sorry for the harm the character had caused. In subsequent interviews, Azaria said he had spent considerable time meeting with members of the South Asian community, listening to their experiences, and concluding that his earlier defenses of the character had been wrong. He has not voiced Apu since. The producers, at around the same time, made a broader decision that the show's white voice actors would no longer voice non-white characters, and several other long-running characters were quietly recast. Apu has not appeared as a speaking character since, although he has occasionally appeared as a silent background present. There is no public plan, at the moment of this recording, to bring him back as a speaking character. The conspiracy reading of the Apu story is not that anything was hidden. It is that the show has, by the way it handled the character, revealed something about itself. The Simpsons has, for most of its run, been celebrated as a show that satirizes every group equally. It is part of the show's identity that it goes after everyone. The conversation around Apu was the moment at which that identity collided with the actual experience of being one of the groups being satirized, and the show, after some resistance, eventually agreed that the framing was not enough. The characters had to change. The casting had to change. The voice had to change. This is, in television terms, a quiet revolution, and it took years to play out, and it left a beloved character in a strange kind of limbo, half present, no longer voiced, no longer at the center of any story. He is, in a way, the show's own retcon of itself, applied to a single character. He is the Armin Tamzarian of the Quickie Mart, in a sense. The show changed its mind, the universe of Springfield was edited around the change, and the change has, by mutual unspoken agreement, been allowed to settle without being constantly relitigated. There is another departure inside the show that has a similar texture, and it touches on the strange place voice acting holds in the architecture of long-running animation. The episode is called Alone Again, Natura Diddley, written by Ian Maxstone Graham, and it aired on the 13th of February, 2000. It is the episode in which Maude Flanders, Ned Flanders' wife, is killed, hit by a salvo of t-shirts from a t-shirt cannon at a racetrack. She falls from the top of the grandstand. The death is sudden, played as broad comedy in the moment, and then deeply mourned in the rest of the episode and in episodes that follow. It is one of the few permanent deaths in the show's history. Maude does not come back. She remains dead. Ned, after a long grieving arc, eventually remarries. The conspiracy around Maude is not about whether she really died. She did. The conspiracy is about why. The widely reported public story, which the show has neither fully confirmed nor fully denied over the years, is that the actress who voiced Maude, Maggie Roswell, had been in a long-running pay dispute with the show related to her splitting her time between Los Angeles and a home in Denver, and that the dispute had reached a point at which her continued participation was uncertain. The Maude character was small enough that her permanent absence would not break the show, but she was beloved enough that a sudden death would mean something. The episode was written, and the death was filmed, and Maude was gone. Maggie Roswell, in interviews afterwards, has confirmed parts of this story, and has said she was upset by how it was handled, and has said she would have preferred to negotiate a more graceful exit. She did return to the show later, voicing other characters, and that return has continued for many years. The reading some fans have built on top of this story is that the show has, throughout its run, used in show deaths as solutions to behind-the-scenes problems. The number of times this has happened is small, but it is not zero. Other beloved minor characters have left the show under similar real-world circumstances, and their in-show fates have sometimes mirrored the negotiating positions of the actors who voiced them. None of this is sinister. It is, in fact, fairly common in long-running television, where the line between a character and the performer of that character is always a little blurred, but the Maude case made it visible in a way that earlier exits had not, because the death was so public and the funeral was so prolonged, and the consequences for the surviving characters were so loving. Ned Flanders' grief is one of the most genuinely tender story arcs the show has ever done. And on the deepest reading, the tenderness was, in part, the show's own quiet apology for the way the exit had been engineered. The episode does not say it, but the episode aired, and the actress did not return as Maude, and the show has remembered her with care ever since. We have not yet reached the strangest part of the conspiracy, and you may have been waiting for it. It is the part that lives almost entirely on the internet, and it has nothing to do with what is on screen. It is the part that includes the creepypasta. The most famous of these, by far, is a piece of fan fiction that has come to be known by the title Dead Bart. The story, written by an anonymous user and posted to various horror websites in the early 2010s, claims to be a first-hand account of an unaired episode of The Simpsons that the author found on a degraded tape in a relative's archive. An episode in which Bart Simpson actually dies, in which the family genuinely mourns him, and in which strange behind-the-scenes details, names, dates, faces of writers are buried in the credits. The story is well known enough now that it has spawned its own ecosystem of follow-up creepypasta, fake screenshots, deepfake animation, and a small mythology of supposed lost episodes that exist only on the internet and have never aired anywhere. We can say this clearly. Dead Bart is not real. It is not a lost episode. It is a piece of horror fiction written by a fan in the same tradition as countless other internet horror stories of the same era. There is no degraded tape. There is no hidden funeral episode. There is no scrubbed credit list. The episode exists only in the form of words on a web page, and any video that purports to show it is, by definition, a fan-made imitation. This is verifiable. The Simpsons production company has never produced an episode by that name. Fox has never aired one. The voice actors have never recorded one. But the cultural fact of Dead Bart is, in a strange way, more interesting than the story itself. The story spread because there was already an emotional readiness for it. The show had been on the air for so long and had so many episodes that the possibility of a hidden, lost, unauthorized one felt, to many viewers, almost plausible. The show had a long history of dark Halloween episodes. The show had a long history of imagining the deaths of its main characters. The show had, in real seasons, killed characters and mourned them. A horror story about a lost Bart funeral episode plugged into all of those existing currents. It did not need to be true to feel true. And the fact that so many people, including reasonably media literate ones, briefly believed in it or wanted to believe in it, tells you something about what the show had become in the public imagination by the early 2010s. It had become large enough that it could plausibly be hiding something. That is the conspiracy in miniature. The show is so big that it could be hiding anything. And once you believe that, every other claim becomes plausible too. There is a layered version of this same myth that focuses on a fictional unaired short from the Tracey Ullman era, sometimes referred to under other names. Again, this is fan fiction. The Tracey Ullman shorts that exist are well documented, are listed in production records, and have been compiled and released in various unofficial collections. There is no hidden short that depicts the family in some horrific tableau. The myth exists, the short does not. But the persistence of the myth tells you that even before the internet age, the show had already developed a kind of secret reputation. People wanted to believe that something about it was being hidden. People wanted to believe that the cheerful surface was a mask. That feeling did not come from nowhere. It came from the show itself, from the strange melancholy embedded in the original pilot, from the unanswered questions about Skinner and Springfield and the floating timeline, from the unsettling logic of episodes like Homer's Enemy, from the fact that the show has, for decades, openly winked at the audience about its own constructedness. The creepypasta is the audience picking up that wink and running with it further than the show itself ever would. There is one more piece in the creepypasta tradition that is worth holding in mind, because it is the one that comes closest to actually existing on screen. It is not a lost episode. It is a real episode. It aired in May 2000 as the season 11 finale. It is called Behind the Laughter. It is structured as a mock documentary in the style of the actual cable music network show Behind the Music, which was popular at the time. The conceit is that The Simpsons is not a cartoon. Within its own diegetic frame, it is a long-running reality television show in which an actual family from somewhere in Middle America was discovered, signed to a network deal, and turned into the world-famous Simpsons family. The episode walks through their fictional rise, their fictional disputes, their fictional substance abuse problems, their fictional breakups and reconciliations, all in the deadpan tone of a real documentary narrated in a voice that mirrors the actual Behind the Music house style. It is one of the most quietly radical episodes the show has ever produced. Because for 22 minutes, the show looks directly at its own status as a constructed object and invites the audience to consider that everything they have been watching for 11 seasons might be, in some sense, a performance by ordinary people who have been playing characters for money. The episode is funny. It is openly absurd. Nobody is meant to take the conceit literally, but it has stuck in the imagination of fans precisely because once you have seen it, it is hard to fully unsee. The framing it offers, that the family is a family of actors playing themselves, never goes away. Every subsequent episode can, if you choose to read it that way, be watched as a performance by a fictional family of performers. The show, of course, has continued to operate as a normal cartoon since. The conceit has not been revisited in earnest, but it sits in the canon, the only episode that exists with that frame, and the only episode that exists which, in its own terms, contradicts the entire rest of the show. The conspiracy reading of Behind the Laughter is that it was, structurally, the show's midlife confession. By the year 2000, the show was over a decade old. The original creative team had been changing. The voice actors had been negotiating for higher pay. The audience had been arguing for several years about whether the show had peaked. Behind the Laughter, read this way, is the writers admitting that the show is a long-running performance, that the performers are real people with real disputes, and that the audience's relationship to the family is a kind of contract with a production, not a relationship with imaginary people. The episode is, on this reading, an apology for some of the rougher edges of the show's recent seasons and a quiet announcement that the show is going to keep going regardless. The episode ends with the family reuniting, vowing to keep making episodes, and the credits rolling under a triumphant theme. It is, in a way, a renewal vow disguised as a parody. Whether the writers intended that reading or not, the episode lands as one. And the show, in the season since, has often felt like the long second act of a renewal vow, with all the difficulties that the second act of any long marriage carries. It is worth, while we are still inside the early 2000s, walking carefully through one more piece of the conspiracy, and it is the piece that most fans of the show experience but cannot quite name. It is the question of decline. There is a widespread feeling, repeated in countless online posts and conversations, that The Simpsons stopped being the show it was, sometime around the late 90s or early 2000s, and that whatever it became after that point is a different show, recognizable in its surfaces, hollow in its center. This is interpretation. The show itself has never confirmed it. The writers, in interviews, often push back against it. But it is so widely felt that any serious walk through the show's history has to address it. And the deeper reading of it is more interesting than the easy reading of it. The easy reading is that the show got worse. The writers ran out of ideas, the voice actors got tired, the network got greedy, the animation got cheaper, the jokes got broader. That is the surface reading, and it has truth in it, but it is also too simple. The deeper reading is that the show changed registers. In its first decade, The Simpsons was, in the strict sense, a satire. It used the family as a frame through which to look at American culture, American politics, American religion, American work, American family. The jokes were specific. The targets were precise. The episodes had thesis statements you could write out in a sentence. In its second decade and into its third, the show drifted from satire into pastiche. The targets became fuzzier. The episodes became more about plot mechanics than about argument. The family became, in some sense, more cartoonish, more flexible, more willing to do anything for it. That is not the same thing as getting worse. it is becoming a different kind of show. But because the audience formed during the first kind of show, the audience reads the change as decline. A subtler reading is that the writers, over time, became more aware of the show as a brand than as an argument. Once the brand existed, once the Yellow family was on lunchboxes and t-shirts and the toy aisles of every major retailer in the country, the writers had to write toward the brand, not toward the original satire. Every joke had to be a joke that worked within the existing universe, not a joke that risked the universe. Every storyline had to leave the family roughly where it found them, not push them somewhere new. Every guest star had to be paid off, not undermined. The show's success ate the show's freedom. That is not a conspiracy in the strong sense. It is just what happens to any cultural product that becomes a brand. But the show has, over the years, occasionally dropped hints that the writers know this. Behind the Laughter is one such hint. The Principal and the Pauper is another. Several Treehouse of Horror segments have, in their own way, made jokes about the show's lost edge. The hints are there. The audience has noticed. The show keeps going. That leads us, naturally, to the Treehouse of Horror question, because it is one of the most strangely shaped pieces of the entire architecture of the show. The Treehouse of Horror is the show's annual Halloween special, in which the Simpsons family is placed inside a series of horror, science fiction, or fantasy scenarios that have no connection to the rest of the show's continuity. They have been running since season 2, when the first one aired in October of 1990. There are now well over 30 of them. They have parodied almost every major work of horror fiction in the English language, from Poe to Stephen King to The Twilight Zone to modern slasher cinema. They have, in their best years, contained some of the show's most inventive and unsettling animation. And, because they are officially non-canonical, they have allowed the writers to do things to the family they cannot do in the regular show. The family has died hundreds of times in Treehouse of Horror segments. The family has been transformed, replaced, eaten, sent to other dimensions, possessed by demons, replaced by robots, replaced by aliens, replaced by alternate versions of themselves. None of it counts. Or at least, that is the official line. A deeper reading of Treehouse of Horror is that the segments are, in some quiet way, a release valve for the show. They are the place where the writers can do what they cannot do in regular episodes. They are the place where Bart can actually die, where Lisa can actually be replaced, where Springfield can actually be destroyed, where the family can actually leave the universe they live in. The fact that none of it counts in canon does not mean none of it counts in the show's emotional logic. It counts as the show's nightmares about itself. The Treehouse of Horror specials are, on this reading, the dreams of the regular show, the place where its unconscious can speak. And once you start watching them that way, certain segments take on a much heavier weight. There is the segment in which Homer travels through a series of alternate worlds, each one a darker and more compromised version of the one before, until he ends up in a dimension that looks suspiciously like our own. There is the segment in which Bart, having sold his soul to Milhouse for a few dollars, finds himself stripped of warmth, unable to laugh, unable to feel anything. There is a segment in which the entire town is found to be a simulation. The segments are jokes, they are also confessions, and the show, by keeping them outside of canon, gets to keep both registers without ever having to resolve them. There's one Treehouse of Horror segment that has earned its own quiet myth among long-term fans, because it does something the show almost never does anywhere else. It looks at the audience. In the segment, the family realizes they are being watched. They realize their lives are a performance. They realize the laughter they hear is not coming from inside their town. The realization is played for comedy, but the segment ends without the realization being undone, and the family, in the closing frames, simply accepts that they live in front of an audience. That moment is, in the long architecture of the show, one of the strangest. It does what Behind the Laughter did, but without the safety of a parody framing. It is just the family, looking out, knowing. The show has not returned to that moment. It has not built on it, it has not erased it, it just sits there in the catalog, available for anyone who wants to find it. That is the way the show carries its own deepest themes. It puts them in places where you can find them, but does not insist that you do. We should slow down now and walk into a different piece of the conspiracy, the one that lives at the most literal level, the question of the look, the yellow skin, the four fingers, the overbite, the strange anatomy. This part of the story is not as glamorous as the prediction story or the Skinner retcon, but it touches the conspiracy at a deeper level than either of those, because it is about what the show is. It is about why the Simpsons family looks the way it does, and what that look has done to the audience over the last several decades. The yellow skin question, in particular, has a real production answer and a real cultural reception, and the gap between the two has been productive ground for theory. The production answer is documented. Matt Groening, in the late 1980s, was working with the colorist Georgi Palouse on the look of the family. They wanted the show to be instantly recognizable on a television set in a living room across the country, even with no sound, even at a glance. They wanted you to be able to walk into a room and know, from the color of the screen, that The Simpsons was on. They tried various skin tones. The one that worked best was a saturated, almost industrial yellow. It was eye-catching. It read at any distance. It was not the color of any human skin, and that was the point. The family was, from the first frame, not meant to look human. They were meant to look like a cartoon. Once the yellow was chosen, the rest of the palette was built around it. Marge's blue hair, Homer's white shirt, Bart's red. The color scheme of the show is a single design decision made in a small studio in the service of making the show recognizable on a low-resolution television set in 1989. That is the production answer. The cultural reception is more complicated because the yellow, once chosen, became one of the most recognizable visual brands in the history of television. The family is, in fact, recognizable at a glance from across a parking lot, on a billboard, on a t-shirt. The choice worked, and once it worked, it became a kind of cultural object in its own right. The yellow stopped being a color and became a marker of an entire genre of animation. The Family Guy creators, in interviews, have said that one of the reasons they chose the color palette they chose was to differentiate from The Simpsons yellow. Similar things have been said by the creators of King of the Hill, Bob's Burgers, South Park, and a dozen other animated family sitcoms. The yellow shaped the entire neighborhood it created, and it shaped in a quiet way the conspiracy reading too. Because if the family does not look like any human family, then the show is not, in any strict sense, set in the human world. It is set in a world where humans look like cartoon yellow beings, and the dogs and the cats look like real dogs and cats, and the squirrels look like squirrels. And that asymmetry, once you notice it, never quite goes away. The family is not yellow because they have jaundice, or because they are sick, or because the writers are commenting on race. The family is yellow because the show is not pretending to be reality. It is, openly, a constructed object. The yellow is the constant signal that the show is a show. There are smaller pieces of the visual conspiracy too. The four fingers. Almost every character on the show has 4 fingers per hand. The exception, famously, is God, who, in his rare appearances, has 5. The joke is older than The Simpsons, going back to early animation traditions, in which characters were drawn with 4 fingers because 4 fingers was simpler to draw and faster to animate. But the show has built a small theological structure around it. God has 5, everyone else has 4. The implication, if you want to read it that way, is that there is a hierarchy in the show's universe, and the difference between humans and the divine is visible in the hands. Nobody quite states this as a doctrine inside the show, but it is a consistent visual rule, and a small consistent rule in a show that has so much chaos is itself a kind of theology. There is also the question of the overbite. Every character on the show, with very few exceptions, has a distinctive overbite, a jaw shape that comes from Matt Groening's original drawing style. The overbite in the early seasons was sharper. In later seasons, it has been softened on most characters, but kept on some. It is the kind of design choice that audiences register without consciously naming, and it is part of what makes a Simpsons character recognizable even when redrawn in a different style. It is part of the brand, and like the yellow and the 4 fingers, it has, in its small way, contributed to the sense that the show is taking place in a universe whose rules are not quite ours. The world looks normal. The people are not. We can stay inside the visual conspiracy a little longer, because there's one more piece in it that touches on something larger: the couch gag, the chalkboard gag, the endlessly varied opening sequence. These are not strictly conspiracies, but they are, in their own way, part of the show's deliberate strategy of self-awareness. The chalkboard gag, in which Bart is shown writing some satirical line repeatedly at the start of the show, is itself a quiet acknowledgement that the show knows what it is. It is a small, weekly meta joke, available to anyone who wants to find it. The couch gag is the same. It is a tiny ritual in which the family enters the living room in some impossible way, sometimes as the actual family, sometimes as something else, sometimes as a parody of another animation style, sometimes as a brief act of avant-garde art directed by a guest artist. The couch gag is, in the show's architecture, the place where the show can do anything for 30 seconds, and where the show can also remind the audience that it is a show. The chalkboard, the couch, the credits, the title card, the recurring opening of the day at the power plant, and the day at the school, and the day at the supermarket, these are the show's rituals. They are how the show makes itself a show every week in the same way, with small variations. They are the show's continuity in a world where the continuity has otherwise been allowed to drift. So we have a family that is openly not human, in a town that is officially not anywhere, with a history that has been formally rewritten, with characters who survive things that should kill them, with a father who is, on certain readings, a kind of local god, with a Halloween special that functions as the show's unconscious, with a self-aware midlife retrospective episode that opens the door to reading the entire show as a performance, and with a public reception that has, for at least 3 decades, been intermittently convinced that the show can see the future. None of this is a conspiracy in the strong sense. All of it is, in the quiet sense, a conspiracy. A conspiracy is, in the original meaning of the word, a breathing together. The show breathes together. The pieces fit. The fact that they fit so well is what makes the audience want to look for the larger pattern. The fact that the larger pattern is mostly a coincidence of long-running storytelling does not make the pattern any less real. The pattern is real. The conspiracy is in the eye of the watcher. There are more threads to pull, and we have not yet pulled the ones that go deepest into the show's actual texture. Let us go now to the question of Bart Simpson, because Bart is the character who, more than any other, has been the center of the show's strangest theories, and because the questions around Bart tie together almost every other thread we have already touched. Who is Bart Simpson? What kind of child is he? What is the show actually saying about him? And what does the show think will happen to him? Bart, in the strict canonical sense, is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old since the show started. He is the eldest child of Homer and Marge Simpson, the older brother of Lisa and Maggie, and a 4th grader at Springfield Elementary, where, in nearly every episode, he is the subject of the patience or impatience of his teacher, Edna Krabappel, played for many years by the late Marsha Wallace, who died in 2013, and after whose death the character was retired with great dignity. Bart's role in the show is, in the early seasons, the role of the troublemaker, the prankster, the iconic skateboarding rebel whose catchphrases became, in the early 90s, an actual cultural panic. He was, at various points in the early years, the most famous character on American television, the subject of countless parental complaints, the center of a moral debate about whether his attitude was acceptable in classrooms. Schools at one point banned t-shirts featuring his image. Time magazine put him on its cover. The First Lady of the time made a public comment about him. The show became, at the start, a Bart show. Then, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th season, the show changed. Homer became the center. Bart became one supporting character among several. The reason for the change, told and retold in writers' room interviews, is that the writers found Homer easier to write deep stories about. Bart's character was, in the early years, structured around a single trait, mischievous defiance, and that trait wore thin as a story engine. Homer, in contrast, contained multitudes. He could be greedy, tender, foolish, loving, jealous, brave, cowardly, sometimes all in the same episode. The show shifted toward Homer because Homer could carry more weight. Bart became, in this new architecture, a character who was loved deeply but written for a little less. He kept his presence but lost some of his centrality. That is the production story, and it is documented in the writers' interviews and in the structure of the seasons themselves. The fan theories about Bart focus on something else. They focus on a series of episodes in which the show, in flash forwards, has shown Bart as an adult, and in which the Bart of the future is, almost without exception, a disappointment. He is rarely successful. He is rarely happy. He is rarely settled. In one future episode, he is a struggling lawyer. In another, he is a tow truck driver living above a strip club. In another, he is divorced and lonely. In another, he is barely employed. As far as fans have pieced together, there is one future episode in which he holds an unexpectedly important position, but the writing of that one is a parody, and it does not stick as canon in the same way that none of the futures stick. The futures contradict each other. They are not a single timeline, but what they share is a tone. They share a sadness. They share a sense that Bart, the boy who was in the early 90s the most famous mischievous child in America, is, in his own imagined future, a man whose mischief did not carry him very far. This has produced one of the most enduring fan theories about the show, sometimes called the failed Bart theory. The reading is that the show, in its own quiet way, has been writing toward a particular tragic arc for Bart for 30 years. The boy who skateboards in the opening credits, who terrorizes his teachers, who calls his father by his first name, who sells his soul to Milhouse, who hosts a pirate radio station, who briefly becomes famous as a television character, is, in the show's long imagination, a boy whose precocious confidence will not hold up under the weight of adulthood. Lisa, in the imagined futures, almost always succeeds. Maggie, in many of the imagined futures, becomes a musician, or a senator, or an artist. Bart, in the imagined futures, falters. He is loved by his family. He is not abandoned. But he is, in episode after episode of Flash Forward, a man who has come down from his early peak and who is trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. The interpretation fans have built around this is that the show has been, all along, making a quiet argument about American boyhood. It is the argument that the most charismatic, most defiant, most loud children are not always the ones who win in the long run. It is the argument that the same energy that makes a child famous can, without the right guidance and the right context, leave that child stranded in adulthood. Bart's flash forwards are, on this reading, a long, slow, deeply melancholy meditation on what happens to the kid who peaks at 10. The show does not insist on this reading. It plays the flash forwards for jokes, mostly. But the consistency of the sadness across decades of different writers and different futures suggests that the show, at some level beyond conscious authorship, has been telling this story. The episodes themselves do not say it, but the pattern is there to be read. There is a counter pattern around Lisa, and it is no less interesting. Lisa, in the show's flash forwards, almost always thrives. She becomes president in the Bart to the Future episode, the same episode that produced the so-called Trump prediction. She becomes a vegetarian academic in another. She becomes the moral center of her own future family in another. She becomes a successful writer, a successful musician, a successful policymaker, a successful adult in almost every imagined future the show has produced. The contrast with Bart is sharp. The boy falters. The girl succeeds. That contrast, in a long-running show written by a rotating staff over 30-plus years, did not happen by accident. It is, in some quiet way, what the show wants to argue. The reading is that the show has been, from its earliest seasons, on Lisa's side, and that the louder fame of the early Bart years was a kind of misdirection, in which the audience was drawn in by the showy son, while the show itself was patiently building its longer argument around the thoughtful daughter. This is, in a way, the deepest piece of the conspiracy. Not that any villain is at the center of it, not that any cabal of writers has been planning anything, but that the show, over its long lifetime, has produced an internal moral arc that almost nobody in the public conversation sits down to map. The arc is that the character the world loved first was, in the long run, less prepared for adulthood than the character who was patiently treated as the secondary one. The show, on this reading, has been telling its real story through Lisa for decades, while letting the audience think it was telling its story through Bart. That is not a sinister conspiracy. It is closer to a moral argument hidden in plain sight. But it is part of what makes the show feel as if it knows something it is not quite saying. It does know. It has been saying it. The audience has, mostly, not been listening. There is one more piece of the Bart and Lisa puzzle, and it is the smallest piece, the one fans hold most closely. It is the way the show treats their relationship. Bart and Lisa, in the show's early seasons, were often antagonists. He pranked her. She corrected him. He resented her intelligence. She resented his fame inside the family. The dynamic was the standard older brother, younger sister dynamic of nearly any American sitcom of the period. But over time, in episode after episode, the show has dug into their relationship and found something gentler underneath. They protect each other. They surprise each other. They confess things to each other that they cannot confess to their parents. There is an episode in which Bart, despite all of his apparent indifference to Lisa's life, defends her in a way that even she does not know about. There is an episode in which Lisa, despite all of her apparent disapproval of Bart's behavior, helps him conceal something from their parents. There is a moment in the flash-forward episode known as Lisa's Wedding, in which the adult Bart, even as a struggling adult, is present at his sister's wedding, and the show stages the moment with a tenderness that is hard to fake. The relationship, across the long history of the show, has become one of the most quietly loving sibling dynamics in animated television. That is not a conspiracy. That is a piece of patient craft. But it is also part of what makes the show feel as if it has a soul. And the soul of a show is the thing that lets the conspiracy theories grow around it. Let us now turn to a piece of the conspiracy that is the most sensitive, and the one the show itself has handled with the most care. It is the question of religion. The Simpsons is, depending on how you count, one of the most religiously engaged sitcoms in the history of American television. The family, in their core canonical state, attends church on Sundays. The town has multiple congregations. There is a Christian minister, the Reverend Lovejoy, who appears in dozens of episodes and has his own backstory, his own marriage, his own crisis of faith, his own daughter. There is a deeply observant evangelical Christian neighbor, Ned Flanders, who is one of the most consistently rendered religious characters on long-running American television. There is, in dozens of episodes across the show's history, an actual depiction of the Christian God, with a beard, with 5 fingers, who speaks to characters and intervenes in their lives. There are Jewish characters, there are Hindu characters, there are Buddhist characters, there are characters who lose their faith and then find it again. There is, in a season 8 episode called Homer the Heretic, a sustained meditation on whether Homer's casual Sunday morning relationship with God is somehow more genuine than the formal one preached in church. That episode ends with a literal conversation between Homer and a literal God, in which God seems to side, in a quiet way, with Homer's right to find his own path. That is real. That is on the show. That is what the show has been doing for decades, and it has done it without ever quite picking a side. The show takes religion seriously enough to put God in episodes. The show takes secularism seriously enough to let Homer skip church and still be the protagonist. The show takes evangelicalism seriously enough to make Ned Flanders a genuinely beloved character whose faith is, in episode after episode, framed as a source of strength rather than as a punchline. And the show takes doubt seriously enough to let the Reverend Lovejoy, in one of his most quietly tender episodes, openly admit to Marge that he no longer knows what he believes. That is, for a network sitcom on Fox, a remarkable level of religious engagement, and it has, for the most part, been done without provoking either of the warring camps in the American culture wars about religion. The conspiracy reading here is not that there is anything hidden. It is that the show has, by being so quietly even-handed, become a strange kind of cultural common ground. It is one of the few shows that observant religious viewers have continued to watch in the decades since the broader American culture became more polarized. It is one of the few shows in which God can appear without setting off a public argument. It is one of the few shows that has allowed both faith and doubt to be funny without dismissing either. That, in a culture in which most televised conversations about religion turn quickly into a fight, is itself a quiet conspiracy. The show has been holding open a space that almost no other show has been able to hold, and it has held it not by avoiding religion, but by engaging with it deeply, repeatedly, and on the terms of every character involved. You can read this as accidental, you can read it as deliberate. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The show was, in its early seasons, written by a staff that included people of various religious backgrounds, including a number of writers who had grown up in observant Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant households. Their experience showed in the work. The writer's room treated religion as a real part of American life, not as a side topic. That decision, made early, has been kept across decades. The result is one of the longest sustained religious portraits in American television, and one of the most balanced. None of this is widely discussed in the prediction discourse. None of it shows up in the listicles. But it is, in its own way, part of what gives the show the weight that makes the conspiracy theories around it stick. The show treats serious things seriously. That is part of why audiences have continued to project so much onto it. We have now reached the part of the conspiracy that touches on Hank Scorpio. It is a small piece, but it is one of the show's most beloved single episode characters, and it has, over the years, produced a small, persistent theory all of its own. The episode is called You Only Move Twice. It aired in season 8 in November of 1996, written by John Swartzwelder, and it is, by many accounts, one of the most universally loved episodes of the entire show. The premise is that Homer is recruited away from the Springfield nuclear power plant to join a much more glamorous company in a town called Cypress Creek, run by an enormously charismatic CEO named Hank Scorpio, voiced by Albert Brooks. Scorpio is, on the surface, the friendliest, warmest, most enthusiastic boss anyone could imagine. He encourages Homer. He notices Homer. He gives Homer responsibility and freedom and praise. He is also, as the audience slowly realizes, a Bond villain. His company, while it is being a wonderful workplace, is also engineering a global threat involving captured government agents, a doomsday weapon, and an attempt to extort the world's governments. Homer never quite notices. The show, by the end of the episode, has positioned Scorpio as a man so perfectly designed to be liked by his employees that even when his real nature becomes obvious to the audience, his employees, including Homer, remain loyal to him. The fan theory that has grown around You Only Move Twice is that Hank Scorpio is, in the show's quiet symbology, the figure of the modern good boss, the figure that every employee secretly wishes they had, the figure who notices you, encourages you, sees you as more than your job. The episode is, on this reading, a satire of the cult of the great boss, written years before the cult was as fully developed as it is today. The episode argues that the perfect boss may be exactly the kind of person who would, in his off hours, destroy the world, and that you would not necessarily notice because you would be too grateful for the recognition. The episode does not state this thesis. It is, on its surface, an extended joke, but the thesis is there, available, and it has grown more relevant, not less, over the decades since the episode aired. That is, again, part of why the show feels prophetic. It often is not, but it often is paying attention to things the rest of the culture takes years to catch up with. Folded into the same thread is the smaller question of why so many of The Simpsons' best episodes are about work, about bosses, about the experience of being inside a large company that does not see you as a full person, about the slow erosion of the soul that comes from too many years at a desk. The show's depiction of the Springfield nuclear power plant, with Mr. Burns as its owner, with Smithers as his perfect assistant, with Homer as the safety inspector who is genuinely unqualified for any kind of safety role, has become one of the most enduring satires of American corporate life ever produced. The plant is openly dangerous, the boss is openly evil, the workers are openly miserable. And the show, episode after episode, returns to the plant, treats it as the center of Homer's adult life, and gives him moments of dignity inside it that the plant itself does not deserve to host. That is one of the longer arguments the show makes. It is also part of why the show is so beloved by people who themselves have spent many years at desks they did not particularly want to be at. Mr. Burns himself is worth a section of his own because he is, by some measures, the most stylized character in the show. By most accounts, in canon, he is at least 100 years old. He has, in flashbacks, been depicted as a child during the early 1900s, as a teenager during the First World War, as a young man during Prohibition, as a middle-aged industrialist during the Second World War, and as an old man during every decade since. He has been, at various points, a Nazi sympathizer, a friend of fascists, a hunter of endangered species, an oppressor of workers, a polluter of the local environment, a destroyer of the Springfield ecosystem, and a frankly cackling cartoon villain. The show has, in episode after episode, made Mr. Burns into a kind of avatar of every concentration of American wealth across the 20th century. He owns the power plant. He owns the workers. He owns the politicians. He owns the police, at times. He owns the church, at times. He owns, in some episodes, the sun, which he literally blocks in a famous late season 6 storyline that we're about to come back to. The deeper reading of Mr. Burns is that he is the show's only undisguised political statement. Every other character is complicated. Every other character has been shown in different lights. Mr. Burns has always been, from his first appearance, an embodiment of accumulation without restraint. He does not have an arc. He does not redeem. He does not soften, except in brief comic moments that are inevitably reversed by the next episode. He remains, for 30 years and counting, exactly what he was on the day he first appeared. He is the show's reminder that there is a kind of power that the rest of the universe of Springfield cannot influence. The kindness of Marge cannot influence him. The intelligence of Lisa cannot influence him. The mischief of Bart cannot influence him. The chaos of Homer cannot influence him, except by accident. The show has, by keeping him unchanged, made a quiet argument about how the most concentrated kinds of wealth tend to behave over time, which is to say, they do not. They simply continue. The Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline, which ran across the season 6 finale in May of 1995 and the season 7 premiere in September of 1995, is worth pausing on because it is one of the most documented moments of what television used to be like before the internet rewrote the relationship between a show and its audience. The premise of the cliffhanger is that, after a chain of escalating crimes against the town, Mr. Burns is shot one evening on the steps of the town hall, and the identity of the shooter is left as an open mystery across the summer break. The show, for the first time in its history, was running a season-long whodunit, and the marketing campaign around it was, by the standards of the mid-1990s, enormous. There were promotional materials. There were contests. There was, famously, a sweepstakes in which a viewer could call a special telephone number and guess the identity of the shooter for the chance to win cash and an appearance in the show. The catch was that the show, internally, had filmed multiple possible solutions. The writers had recorded scenes pointing to several different suspects in order to keep the actual solution hidden from leaks. Most of those alternate scenes have, over the years, been released in DVD bonus features and in interviews. There is, for example, an alternate scene in which Smithers is the shooter. The real solution, in the second part of the story, is that the shooter is Maggie, the baby of the family, who, in a complex chain of accidents, fires Mr. Burns' own gun at him during a moment of confusion. The reveal is gentle. The intent is not, in the legal sense, attempted murder. The show explains it as a moment of unintended consequence in which a baby's grasping reflex catches the trigger of a stolen gun. The episode is structured as a parody of the Dallas-style cliffhanger of a previous decade of American television. The deeper reading of Who Shot Mr. Burns is not about who actually shot him. It is about what the storyline represented. It was the first time a sitcom of this scale had ever asked its audience to wait, to theorize, to engage with a single mystery across an entire summer. It was, in retrospect, a prototype of what the internet would later do to almost every television show. People formed clubs. People sent in their guesses. Talk shows interviewed Simpsons writers about possible solutions. The show became, briefly, a public puzzle, and the public puzzle worked. The story became, for several months, a piece of the national conversation. The marketing department of the show, the writer's room, and the network worked together in a way that, in the mid-1990s, was almost unprecedented for animated television. The result was a model that would be copied over and over by other shows in the decades to come. Lost in 2004. Westworld, 2 decades after that. Almost every prestige drama that has run a season-long mystery has, in some way, descended from this storyline. The Simpsons did it first. The fact that the answer was Maggie is its own quiet joke, and it is, in a way, part of the larger conspiracy. The most powerful figure in Springfield, the man whose presence had loomed over the town for years, was brought down by the smallest figure in the family, the baby who has never spoken a full sentence in canonical episodes. The joke is, on its surface, a satire of cliffhanger conventions. But it is also, on a quieter level, a statement about scale. The very small can topple the very large. The infant can shoot the billionaire. The show plays it for laughs. But the moral logic of the storyline is, in its own way, deeply pointed, and it lines up with 100 other small moral choices the show has made over the years. The largest enemy of accumulated power in the moral universe of The Simpsons is the unintended action of those whom that power has overlooked. We have not yet talked about the children's voices. We should, briefly, because part of the strangeness of the show is that the children are all voiced by adult women. Bart is voiced by Nancy Cartwright, who has voiced him since the very first short on Tracey Ullman in 1987. Milhouse is voiced by Pamela Hayden, who has also voiced Maude Flanders and several other recurring children. Lisa is voiced by Yeardley Smith, who is one of the few characters voiced by a single actor whose voice has not significantly aged on screen, even as the actor herself has lived through almost 40 years of being that character. Maggie is voiced, when she speaks, by various adults, including, famously, in one moment, by Elizabeth Taylor, who recorded a single word for the show as Maggie's first ever spoken word, and who, in interviews afterwards, said the recording session for that one word took longer than expected. Bart's voice has been Nancy Cartwright's voice for almost 40 years. She has, in interviews, said she still feels the character clearly, that he still has things to say, and that when she records him, she does not feel that she is performing an aging version of a child. She feels she is performing the same boy. The strangeness of that, when you sit with it, is the strangeness of the whole show. A boy who is, by canon, 10 years old, who has been 10 for almost 4 decades, whose voice is the voice of a woman who was in her 30s when the show began and is now decades older, and who has, in real life, lived through every change of cultural mood, every shift of language, every passing of friends and family and colleagues, and who returns week after week to the recording booth and becomes a 10-year-old boy. There is no other relationship like that on American television. The voice actors have, in interviews, talked about what it feels like to live next to a character that never ages, that never changes, that is, in some sense, immortal, while the actor walks alongside it through mortality. Some of them have said it is comforting. Some have said it is unsettling. The actor walks, the character stays. There is something philosophical in that arrangement that almost no other piece of long-running media has quite captured. The voice cast is, on this reading, the show's true conspiracy of stillness. The Simpsons family is not aging because the voice cast keeps it from aging. The town is not changing because the voice cast keeps it the same. The show is one of the few cultural products in American history in which a small group of actors has held a single set of voices steady for almost 40 years. Some of them have left, and some of them have died. Phil Hartman, who voiced Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure, was killed in 1998 in circumstances the show has, with care, never made into a joke. Marcia Wallace, who voiced Edna Krabappel, died in 2013, and the character was retired with a quiet on-screen acknowledgement. Russi Taylor, who voiced Martin Prince and several other recurring children, died in 2019. Each of these losses has left a small hole in the canon that the show has, in each case, chosen to honor by not filling. The voices are gone. The characters have largely gone with them. That is, in itself, a kind of fidelity, and it is part of why the show has been able to keep the integrity of its central voice cast for as long as it has. There is one more piece of the voice cast architecture that has, in recent years, become a matter of public discussion, and it is the question of which voices, going forward, the show is willing to keep recasting. We have already talked about the decision in 2020 to stop having white voice actors voice non-white characters. That decision touched Apu, voiced by Hank Azaria. It touched Carl, voiced by Hank Azaria, who is now voiced by Alex Desert. It touched Dr. Hibbert, voiced for many years by Harry Shearer, who is now voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson. It touched several other characters in smaller but documented ways. The show has handled each of these recastings quietly, without on-screen acknowledgement, in the same way it handled the Skinner retcon, by letting the change happen and waiting for the audience to accept it. That is, in itself, a tactic. The show prefers, when possible, to make its biggest changes invisible. The chalkboard gag does not change. The opening credits do not change. The couch does not change. The character voices sometimes change, and the show would rather you simply absorb it than make you stop and acknowledge it. We can pause here and consider one of the longer-running, quieter mysteries inside the show, which is the mystery of Smithers. Waylon Smithers, the loyal assistant to Mr. Burns, has been in the show since season 1. He has, since his earliest appearances, been openly attached to Mr. Burns in a way that the show has, across the years, made progressively more explicit. In the early seasons, Smithers' love for Mr. Burns was framed as an extreme version of professional loyalty. By the late 1990s, the show was openly playing on the joke that Smithers was in love with him, while keeping the joke carefully ambiguous as to whether Smithers' sexuality was being directly stated or merely implied. By the 2010s, the show made the explicit statement. In a season 27 episode, Smithers is openly identified on-screen as a gay man, and he is shown coming out to Mr. Burns, who, in his own oblivious way, fails to understand what he is being told. The episode is handled with care. It is treated as a real moment for the character, and it is the resolution of a quiet character story that the show has been telling, frame by frame, for over 25 years. A deeper reading of Smithers is not that there was anything hidden. It is that the show, by slowly making the implicit explicit, demonstrated something it almost never demonstrates anywhere else, which is the capacity for genuine character growth. Smithers is one of the few characters whose interior life the show has actually changed across the seasons. As far as fans have pieced together, he has had relationships outside of work. He has had friendships that did not involve Mr. Burns. The show has slowly and carefully given him a real life. That is unusual. Most Simpsons characters do not get real lives outside the running gag that defined their first appearance. Smithers got one, and the way he got one is itself a small piece of the conspiracy. The writers, evidently, decided somewhere in the late 1990s or early 2000s that this character deserved more, and they wrote toward it for years. That kind of long-range care is rare in long-running television. It is part of why the show, despite its decline, still has moments of unexpected depth. We can turn now to one of the most contentious pieces of the show's late history, which is the question of guest stars. Across the run of the show, hundreds of celebrities have appeared either as themselves or as fictional characters. The list reads like a catalog of the late 20th and early 21st century English-speaking entertainment industry. It includes Paul McCartney, Linda McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Tom Petty, Elton John, Stevie Wonder, Aerosmith, Sting, and the band U2. It includes Meryl Streep, Glenn Close, Dustin Hoffman in the famous Mr. Bergstrom episode where he is credited under a pseudonym, James Earl Jones, Larry King, Stephen Hawking, who appeared multiple times, Patrick Stewart, Leonard Nimoy. The list goes on, year after year, episode after episode, until almost every major figure in the public English-speaking conversation has, at some point, recorded a line for The Simpsons. The deeper reading of the guest star list is not that there is anything hidden in any individual appearance. It is that, in the aggregate, the show has, by recording so many famous people, become a kind of unofficial archive of the era. If you are looking decades from now for evidence of who was famous in any given year between 1990 and the present, you can simply look at the guest star list of The Simpsons for that year and you will find them. The show has been a passive recorder of cultural prominence, not by design, but by the simple fact that it has been the longest running cultural event with the highest single show celebrity throughput in American television. And because so many of those guest stars have, in the years since their appearances, died or fallen from public attention, the guest list has become, over time, a kind of memorial. Phil Hartman is on it. Michael Jackson, in the now removed episode, was on it. The show is a record, and its record contains losses. That reading is not sinister. It is closer to elegiac. The show, by recording so many people, has become a place where you can hear voices that no other show can offer. And the show, by being so casual about it, has not made a fuss about any individual loss. The voices simply continue to exist in the archive, and the audience, decades later, can encounter them without being told that they are encountering anything special. That is, in a way, the show's most generous gift to its own viewers. It has preserved a moment. The moment is, by now, decades long, but the preservation is real. We can move now into one of the pieces of the conspiracy that gets the most heated reactions in long-term Simpsons discussion communities, and it is the question of the so-called eternal recurrence of certain plot devices. The show has, over the years, returned again and again to certain story shapes. The Lisa loses her faith and finds it again episode. The Marge starts a new job and discovers she does not want it after all episode. The Homer takes up a hobby and abandons it episode. The Bart bonds with a temporary character who then leaves episode. These shapes recur, often with almost the same beats, often with almost the same emotional arc, sometimes within a few seasons of each other. The recurrence has been cataloged by fans who have, in some cases, made entire spreadsheets of the show's standard story shapes and which episodes fit them. The deeper reading of these recurrences is that the show, after a certain point, became a machine for generating variations on a small number of stable templates. That is, in some sense, true of every long-running sitcom. There are only so many shapes a half-hour family comedy can take. But The Simpsons is unusual in that it ran long enough to make the recurrence visible. By season 15 or so, you can sometimes predict the shape of an episode within the first 3 minutes. By season 20, you can sometimes predict the exact beat at which an emotional resolution will arrive. By season 25, certain templates have been used so many times that even die-hard fans struggle to remember which episode used them when. The show, in this late phase, has become a kind of seasonal liturgy. The shapes are familiar. The faces are familiar. The town is familiar. The audience returns not for surprise but for repetition. That, in its own way, is the most honest part of the show's later life. It is no longer trying to be the cutting satirical machine of its early seasons. It is closer to a comfort object, and it is in that role beloved by many people who are not particularly interested in any individual episode, but who simply like that the show is still on. The conspiracy, in this reading, is that the show has, by becoming a comfort object, become almost impossible to kill. The audience does not need a great new episode each week. The audience needs to know that the show is still there. As long as the show is still there, the audience can return when they want to. They do not have to watch every week. They do not have to follow every storyline. They simply have to know that, at the end of a long day, when they cannot face anything new, the family will still be sitting on the couch, and the credits will still be rolling, and the chalkboard will still be there, and the world will still feel, for a moment, the same as it did when they were younger. The show has, in this way, become a piece of personal furniture for millions of people. And once a show has become that, it is much harder to retire than a regular show. Retiring it would feel, to those millions, like a death in the family. The conspiracy is that the network knows this. The writers know it. The voice actors know it. And they have all, in their own ways, agreed to keep the show going for as long as the comfort it provides outweighs any new creative ambition that might justify ending it. That is part of why the question of the show's end has become almost mythological. Fans have, for at least a decade, asked when The Simpsons will end. The answer the producers give, when they answer at all, is some version of not for a long time, possibly never in the foreseeable future. The voice contracts are renewed. The seasons are ordered in batches. The animation pipeline continues. The show has been renewed past season 35 and beyond, with each renewal coming as less of a surprise than the last. The show does not appear to have a planned ending. There is no documented final episode in development. There is no last storyline being teased. The show, more than any other long-running American sitcom, is structurally designed to never have a last episode. It is designed, in a sense, to outlive its own audience. The conspiracy is that the show has become its own perpetual motion machine. There is, however, one episode that has the structure of a possible ending, and it is worth pausing on. It is the episode called Holidays of Future Past, which aired in season 23 in December of 2011, written by Matt Selman. It is, by general consensus, one of the best late period episodes, and it is also, in its way, the episode that comes closest to a series finale that the show has ever produced. The premise is that, decades in the future, the Simpson family returns to the house for the holidays with their now adult children, and the episode follows each of them through their adult lives. Bart is divorced with 2 sons. Lisa is married to Milhouse with a daughter. Maggie is a successful musician about to give birth to her own child. The episode handles each of these futures with care. It treats each of them as real. It allows each of them moments of pain and moments of joy. And it ends with the family together, with Homer and Marge older but recognizable, with the next generation already present, and with a closing image that, if you wanted to read it as a series finale, would work as one. The show, of course, did not end with that episode. It kept going, and it has continued to use Holidays of Future Past as a kind of canonical future that subsequent episodes have referred back to, even as those subsequent episodes have themselves added different futures that contradict the first. The show, true to its own conspiracy of canon, will not commit to any single future, but it has produced in Holidays of Future Past the closest thing to a series ending the show has ever offered. And the fact that the show has kept going past that ending, has kept generating new episodes after the natural emotional arc had been completed, has become, for some long-term fans, the deepest piece of the conspiracy. The show, having written its own ending, chose not to use it, and chose instead to keep going. The conspiracy is that in choosing to keep going, the show has, in a quiet way, refused the dignity of ending. It is, on this reading, a show that is unable to die because the structure around it will not let it die. And the audience, by continuing to watch in dwindling numbers, has, in its own way, allowed the structure to win. We are getting into the deepest part of the long, quiet conspiracy now, and it is the part that has nothing to do with predictions or banned episodes or removed characters. It is the part that is about what the show has, over time, become. Because the show, in its current state, is no longer the show of the early 1990s. It is something else. It is a long, calmly produced, comforting, occasionally inventive, occasionally tired piece of American media. Its voice cast is older, its writers have rotated many times, its animation is now digital. Its release schedule is no longer Sunday nights in front of a captive primetime audience. Its episodes are watched, increasingly, on streaming platforms, in long binges, by viewers who were not alive when the show began. The show has, in real time, become an inheritance. The original audience has aged, and the children of that audience have grown up watching a show that, when they encounter it, has already been running for longer than they have been alive. That changes what the show is. It changes what each new episode means. For a viewer in 1990, the show was a weekly event. The episode that aired on Sunday was new, and the next episode would not be available until next Sunday. For a viewer today, the show is a library. There are over 700 episodes available, more or less, on demand, organized by season, browsable, paused, replayed, available at any moment. The relationship of the audience to the show has changed. even though the show itself has not, in its surface, changed all that much. And that change in relationship is, in itself, part of the conspiracy. The show has, by simply continuing, become the first piece of long-running primetime American animated television to make the transition from being a weekly broadcast event to being a permanent on-demand resource. There is no comparable show. There is no comparable archive. The show is, by sheer accumulation, in a category of one. That status has its own consequences. It means, for one thing, that the show is now part of the cultural diet of a generation of viewers who experience it as a kind of background channel. The show is the show that is on. It is the show that is playing. It is the show that the streaming service automatically queues up when you have nothing else to watch. That role is profitable. It is also, in its way, hollowing. A show that is on as background loses its ability to provoke. It loses its ability to surprise. It loses its ability to be felt. The audience watches without quite watching, and the show, having become background, has, in some ways, become invisible. That is the deepest stage of the conspiracy, and it is the stage we are in now. The Simpsons is the most famous show in television history that almost nobody, in the active sense, watches anymore. The audience knows it exists. The audience can summon any episode they want at any time. But the audience, in its daily life, is no longer reaching for it. The show keeps producing. The audience keeps absorbing without consciously consuming. The machine continues. This is not a conspiracy in the strong sense. It is just what happens to long-running cultural products. But the show, in its specific case, has had the longest time to become this kind of object, and it has done so more completely than any other show. Its yellow palette is recognized everywhere. Its catchphrases are quoted by people who have never seen a full episode. Its characters are recognized by toddlers in countries where the show has never aired in the local language. The show has become, in its essence, a visual language that exists independently of the show itself. You can recognize a Simpsons reference without ever having seen The Simpsons. That is, in cultural terms, the deepest kind of success, and it is also the deepest kind of disappearance. The show has become so familiar that it has become hard to see. The conspiracy, at its most quiet, is that this disappearance has been the show's destination all along. The show, from its earliest seasons, has always been about reproducing itself, about keeping the family on the couch, about keeping the chalkboard available, about keeping the credits rolling. The show is, in its essence, a ritual rather than a narrative, and rituals do not end. They simply, over time, fade from the foreground into the texture of life. The Simpsons has, in its own way, become a piece of the texture of life. It does not need an ending. It does not need a final mystery solved. It does not need to confirm or deny any of the theories that have grown around it. It needs only to continue. And for as long as it continues, the conspiracy will continue too. Because the conspiracy, in the end, is the show itself. The show is the conspiracy. The conspiracy is the show. There are smaller threads we have not yet pulled, and we should pull them now, because each of them adds a piece to the larger picture. The thread about Sideshow Bob, the thread about Krusty, the thread about Moe, the thread about the Tracey Ullman shorts and what they originally meant, the thread about the voice of Homer and the way Dan Castellaneta arrived at it, the thread about the writer's room culture in the early years, the thread about Conan O'Brien and what he wrote before he left to host a late-night show, the thread about Brad Bird, the thread about James L. Brooks. Each of these threads is a small piece of why the show has the shape it has. Each of these threads ties back, in some way, to the larger conspiracy. We can walk through them in turn, and we will, because they are part of the patient work of explaining how a show becomes the kind of object that produces so many other theories. Sideshow Bob. The character has appeared in the show since season 1. He is voiced by Kelsey Grammer. He is, in canon, the former sidekick to Krusty the Clown, a former television performer turned criminal, an educated and well-spoken man whose long-running grudge against Bart Simpson has fueled some of the show's most beloved episodes. Cape Fear, the one with the rake gag, Sideshow Bob Roberts, Black Widower, brother from another series, Sideshow Bob's Last Gleaming, Funeral for a Fiend. Each of them is, in some way, a meditation on the relationship between revenge and absurdity, and each of them has become a fan favorite. The character is unusually deep for a recurring villain in a long-running sitcom. He is given backstory. He is given a brother, voiced by David Hyde Pierce. He is given a son in later episodes. He is given a wife in one episode. He is given moments of genuine moral conflict. A deeper reading of Sideshow Bob is that he is, in some quiet way, the show's image of what Bart could have become. Bob is articulate, where Bart is glib. Bob is well-read, where Bart is willfully ignorant. Bob is a planner, where Bart is improvisational. Bob is, in a way, an alternate Bart from a parallel universe in which Bart's intelligence and ambition were not blunted by his family's chaos. The show does not state this. The show plays Bob as a villain, but the resonance is there, available, and it is part of why the Bart and Bob episodes have a depth other villain episodes do not. Bob is what Bart could become if he were left alone with his ambition long enough. That, in the larger context of the show's quiet argument about Bart's failed adulthood, is a heavy implication. The show does not insist on it, but the pattern is there. Krusty the Clown. He has, in canon, been a children's entertainer in Springfield for decades. He is, in flashbacks, established as having been the favorite of Homer's childhood, and the figure who, in many ways, gave Homer the only joyful television experience of his youth. Krusty himself is, in the show's deeper reading, a deeply troubled man. He has gambling debts, he has health problems, he has multiple ex-wives, he has an estranged father who, in one of the show's most beloved episodes, is revealed to be a rabbi who disapproved of his career choice. That episode, called Like Father, Like Clown, written by Jay Kogan and Wallace Wolodarski, aired in 1991 in season 3 and is one of the show's earliest sustained meditations on Jewish identity, fathers and sons, and the cost of choosing entertainment over inheritance. It is a beautiful episode. It is also, in retrospect, the moment at which the show first signaled that it was willing to do serious dramatic work, not just satire. A deeper reading of Krusty is that he is, in the show's larger map, the image of what entertainment becomes when it runs too long. He is the show, in a sense, reflecting on itself, a man who started as a children's entertainer, who has compromised himself 1,000 times for the next paycheck, who has watched his own act become a kind of self-parody, who has, despite himself, continued. The show, in its later seasons, has occasionally let Krusty's exhaustion speak. In one episode, he openly considers retirement. In another, he tries to reinvent himself as a serious comedian. In another, he simply admits that he is tired. The Krusty stories are, on this reading, the show's own quiet meditation on what it is like to be itself, to be a long-running entertainment, to carry the weight of being beloved for decades, to wonder whether you have anything new left to offer. Whether the writers intend this reading or not, Krusty has, by his very existence, become a mirror that the show holds up to itself. The reflection is sometimes funny, often tender, occasionally devastating. Mo Sislak, the bartender, voiced by Hank Azaria, the owner of Moe's Tavern, a small, unlovely establishment in Springfield where Homer drinks beer in almost every episode. Mo is, in the early seasons, a figure of pure comic ugliness. He is a target of prank phone calls. He is a target of slapstick. He is a target of the show's broader satire of the lonely man at the center of a small American bar. But Mo, like Krusty, like Smithers, like the Reverend Lovejoy, has, over time, been given depth. The show has, in episode after episode, dug into his loneliness. It has shown his failed attempts at relationships. It has shown his recurring suicidal thoughts, often played for dark comedy in a way that, in a less careful show, would feel cruel, and that the show, instead, handles with a strange tenderness. Mo is, in the show's quiet emotional map, the most consistently unhappy character. He has not had Smithers' slow arc towards self-acceptance. He has not had Krusty's occasional moments of dignity. He is, mostly, alone, behind the bar, serving beer to the men who are his only friends. A deeper reading of Moe is that he is the show's portrait of male loneliness in late 20th century America. The figure of the unmarried, lower, middle-class, small business owning man who has, by reasons of personality and circumstance, ended up running a small bar in a town that does not particularly love him. The show, in its handling of Moe, refuses to make him simply a clown. It treats his loneliness as real. It does not solve his loneliness. It does not give him a redemptive arc. It simply, episode after episode, returns to his bar and finds him there and lets him be sad behind the surface jokes. That is, in a long-running sitcom, an unusual choice. Most shows would have given Moe a permanent partner by season 15. The Simpsons has, instead, kept him alone and has kept letting his loneliness be visible and has trusted that the audience can hold the unresolved character without needing him to be fixed. That trust is part of what gives the show its longer emotional weight, and it is part of why Moe, despite his unloveliness, has become, for many viewers, one of the most beloved characters in the show. Homer's voice. Dan Castellaneta has voiced Homer since the very first short on Tracey Ullman in 1987. In the early shorts, the voice was different. By Castellaneta's own account, it was a slightly grunting impression of Walter Matthau, the actor who, in films like The Bad News Bears, had popularized a kind of working-class American grumble. Castellaneta, in those early shorts, performed Homer with that gravelly older man's voice, on the assumption that Homer was meant to be older than he turned out to be. Around the start of the half-hour series in 1989, Castellaneta adjusted. He pulled the voice up, he made it lighter, he found the higher, more childlike register that would become the Homer the audience now knows. The shift is documented. It is audible. If you go back and listen to the Tracey Ullman shorts, Homer sounds older. If you listen to the early half-hour episodes, Homer sounds younger. The voice has stayed roughly steady since then, with small adjustments across the years. A deeper reading of Homer's voice is not that anything was hidden. It is that the voice itself is part of why the show works. The voice, in its current state, is high enough and bright enough to allow Homer to sound, even at his most adult, like an overgrown child. That, in the show's larger map, is essential. Homer is, in many ways, written as a child in an adult's body. He is impulsive. He is hungry. He is easily distracted. He is easily wounded. He is, despite all of his flaws, deeply loving. The voice carries all of that. If Homer were voiced with the gravelly Matthau impression of the original shorts, the show would not work. The character would be too dark, too adult, too cynical. With the lighter voice, the character becomes, in his core, sympathetic, and the show becomes, in its core, capable of warmth. The adjustment Castellaneta made in 1989 is, on this reading, one of the most consequential decisions in the history of American television comedy. It changed what the show could be. It changed what kind of man Homer Simpson could be, and it allowed the show, by giving Homer that voice, to do the long, slow work of building him into the strange, contradictory, deeply beloved figure that he has become. Marge's voice. Julie Kavner has voiced Marge since the very first short. The voice is, by Kavner's own account in various interviews over the years, a rasp she developed by training herself to speak from her lower throat. The voice is gentle, but the rasp is constant. It is one of the most recognizable voices in the history of American animation. The reading of Marge's voice is similar to the reading of Homer's. The rasp gives Marge a particular weight. It makes her sound, at once, world-weary and patient. It allows her to be the moral center of the family without sounding preachy. The voice itself is part of the character. It is part of why Marge has, across the years, become one of the most beloved animated mothers in American television, despite the fact that the show, in its plotting, has often used her as a comic foil rather than as a protagonist. Marge has had her own episodes. She has had her own arcs, but she has, more often than not, been the calm presence in the background, the figure of patience while everything around her falls apart. The voice carries that. The voice, in Kavner's hands, is the soul of the family. Without it, the family does not cohere. The writer's room, the early Simpsons writer's room in 1989 and the years immediately following, was one of the most documented gatherings of comedic talent in American television history. The room included, at various points, Conan O'Brien, who left to become a late-night host, Greg Daniels, who later created The American Office, Mike Reiss and Al Jean, who would become longtime showrunners, Jeff Martin, Jay Kogan, and Wallace Wolodarski, John Swartzwelder, the famously reclusive writer of some of the show's most beloved episodes, Brad Bird, who would later direct The Incredibles and other films, Sam Simon, who shaped much of the early voice of the show and who died in 2015, James L. Brooks, who, with Matt Groening and Simon, was one of the 3 founding architects of the show. The room was, in those early years, both incredibly talented and incredibly young. Many of the writers were in their 20s or early 30s. They were paid relatively little for the workload. They were given enormous creative freedom. They competed with one another for jokes. They rewrote one another's scripts. They produced, in a short window, what is now widely regarded as one of the strongest runs of television comedy ever made. The reading of the early writers' room is not that anything sinister happened in it. It is that the early room set a tone that has shaped every Simpsons writers' room since. The standard for what a Simpsons episode should be, the speed of the jokes, the level of cultural literacy, the willingness to do dramatic moments, all of it was set by those early writers, and the rooms that have followed have, in some sense, been trying to live up to that original tone. That is a difficult tone to maintain. The original room could afford to be experimental because the show was new. Later rooms have had to write inside an existing framework. Later rooms have had to honor established characters. Later rooms have had to work with the brand. The result is that, while the show has produced many strong late period episodes, almost no later season has matched the consistent strength of seasons 3 through 8. That is the audience consensus. It is also the writer's consensus. In most interviews, the early room was the room. The room since have been continuations. The conspiracy that grows out of this is the conspiracy of comparison. The show, by having such a strong early run, has set a standard against which every later season is judged. The judgment is mostly unfair. The show has had to produce roughly 20 episodes a year for over 30 years. No room of writers, however talented, can maintain peak quality across that volume, across that span. The fact that the show has remained, even in its less inspired seasons, watchable, often funny, sometimes genuinely good, is itself remarkable. The conspiracy is that the audience, by holding the early seasons as the standard, has, in a way, prevented itself from seeing what the later seasons actually are. There are excellent episodes in season 20. There are excellent episodes in season 25. There are excellent episodes in the most recent seasons. They are simply buried for many viewers, under the assumption that the show is no longer worth watching. That assumption is itself a piece of how the show is now received, and it is, on a kind reading, slightly unfair to what the show has continued, against the odds, to produce. We have been moving through threads. Let us now slow down and gather them, because we are nearing the place where the conspiracy, in its broadest form, becomes visible. The Simpsons is, on any honest read, several different shows that have been wearing the same yellow skin for nearly 40 years. There is the early show, the sharp satire of the late 1980s and early 1990s, where the family was a vehicle for cultural commentary, and the jokes were targeted and precise. There is the middle show, the golden run from roughly season 3 through season 8, where the writing room operated at peak coordination, and the show became the comedy machine almost every subsequent animated sitcom would try to imitate. There is the late 90s show, where the satire began to soften and the show began to experiment with longer story arcs and with self-awareness. In episodes like The Principal and The Pauper, Homer's Enemy, and Behind the Laughter. There is the 2000s show, where the show, in the wake of the September 11th attacks and the long political shifts that followed, became, in a quiet way, more cautious, more sentimental, less willing to take the sharpest possible angle on any topic. There is the 2010s show, where the show began to engage publicly with the criticism around Apu, where the show began to recast voice actors and rethink characters, where the show began to deal with the long process of becoming an aging cultural institution. And there is the current show, the show of our current moment, which is the comfort object phase, the on-demand library phase, the show that exists more as a presence than as a piece of new media. These are not the same show. They wear the same colors, they use the same opening credits, they share most of the same voices, but they are, in their structure and in their ambition, different shows. The conspiracy is that by sharing the surface, they have all been able to claim the prestige of the early years, even when the later years have done something completely different. That is, in a way, the deepest piece of the conspiracy. The show has, by simply continuing to look like itself, been able to keep its early reputation even as it has changed into something the early reputation no longer quite fits. The early seasons earned the cultural prestige. The later seasons have inherited it. The audience has, mostly, not noticed the inheritance. They have continued to refer to the show as if it were one show. It is not. It is several shows stacked on top of each other, each one quietly pretending to be the previous one. The deeper question, the one that lurks under all of this, is whether the show, in its current state, is conscious of itself in the way that the early show was. Whether the writers in the room today are aware that they are working inside a brand that has, in some ways, become a museum. Whether the voice actors in the booth today are aware that the lines they are delivering will be heard by audiences who experience the show entirely through the lens of nostalgia. Whether the producers at the network are aware that they are now custodians of a cultural artifact rather than makers of a current series. The answer, in interviews, is mostly yes. The current creative team, the current voice cast, the current producers, all of them have spoken in various venues about their awareness of the show's status. They are not, as some critics imagine, blindly making cartoons. They are working, quite consciously, inside a structure that has outlived its original era. The conspiracy is not that they do not know. The conspiracy is that they know, and they keep going anyway. There is dignity in that. There is a particular kind of dignity in continuing to make a thing whose original moment has passed, simply because there are still people who love it, and simply because the act of continuing is itself a service to those people. The show, in this reading, is no longer trying to be the cultural force it was in the early 90s. It is trying to be a familiar presence. That is a smaller ambition. It is also a real one, and it is, in a strange way, an admirable one. Most cultural products, when their moment has passed, simply end. The Simpsons has chosen not to end. It has chosen to keep going as the moment recedes. Whether that choice is right or wrong, it is, on its own terms, a kind of fidelity. The show is being faithful to the audience that still cares. It is doing the patient work of remaining available. That is, in the long view, what the conspiracy turns out to be. The conspiracy is patience. The conspiracy is presence. The conspiracy is the choice to remain. Before we draw the larger picture together for the close, there are a few small pieces of the show's history we have not yet placed, and they deserve placing. There is the question of the movie. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, directed by David Silverman, written by a team including Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, Al Jean, Ian Maxtone Graham, George Meyer, David Merkin, Mike Rice, Mike Scully, Matt Selman, John Swartzwelder, and John Vitti. The movie is a feature-length expansion of the show's existing universe in which Springfield is sealed inside a glass dome by the federal government after Homer pollutes the local lake beyond recovery. The movie was a major commercial success, earning over $500 million worldwide, and it remains, in the strict canonical sense, part of the show's storyline, even though almost no subsequent episode has directly referred to its events. A deeper reading of the movie is that it was, in some sense, the show's mid-career theatrical statement. By making a movie, the show announced that it was still a major creative force. By treating the movie as more or less canonical and then quietly never referring to it again, the show kept the movie as a standalone piece that did not interfere with the weekly continuity. That is, in a way, the show's standard approach to any major event. The event happens. The event is, technically, canon. the event is, in practice, mostly ignored. The show, by treating its own canon as flexible, has been able to do enormous storylines without committing to any of them. The movie joins Behind the Laughter and The Principal and The Pauper and 100 other moments in the show's long history of doing big things and then quietly pretending they did not change anything. The continuity floats. The brand persists. The audience adjusts. There is the question of the parodies. The Simpsons has parodied almost every other major piece of American cultural product across its run. Star Wars, Star Trek, The Twilight Zone, Citizen Kane, Cape Fear, Hitchcock, Kubrick, Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe. Almost every major piece of literature and cinema that an educated American writer in the 1990s would have known has, at some point, been parodied by the show. The parodies, in their best moments, are not just references. They are full reworkings, sometimes lasting an entire episode, sometimes lasting an entire Treehouse of Horror segment, sometimes embedded as smaller running gags across a season. The deeper reading of the parodies is that they have made the show, over time, into a kind of cultural index. If you have watched all of The Simpsons, you have, in a quiet way, been introduced to enormous amounts of 20th century cultural reference. That is part of why the show has been used in college courses, in literature courses, in media studies courses, in linguistics courses, for decades. It is, in some sense, a syllabus disguised as a sitcom. There is the question of the music. The show's score, composed largely by Alf Clausen for many years, has been one of the most consistently strong elements of the show. Clausen, who joined the show in season 2, gave the show a full orchestral identity almost no other animated sitcom of its era had. The score was recorded with a real orchestra for almost every episode. That was, by sitcom standards, extraordinarily expensive. The show kept paying for it for decades. In 2017, Clausen was, controversially, let go from the show in a cost-saving decision that was widely criticized, and his removal was followed by litigation that was eventually settled. The score, since his departure, has been handled by other composers. The orchestral identity of the show has, by some accounts, shifted. By other accounts, it has remained recognizable. A deeper reading of the Clausen story is that it is one of the few moments in the show's history where a creative decision made for business reasons became visible in the work, and where the audience, in noticing, registered a small loss. The show, by parting with Clausen, parted, in a small way, with the sonic texture that had carried it through its strongest years. There is the question of the chalkboard gag itself. The show, in its opening credits, has, for over 30 years, shown Bart writing some satirical line repeatedly on a school chalkboard. The line is different in almost every episode. It has, over the years, included references to current events, jokes about the show itself, jokes about specific episodes, and, in one famous case, a quiet promise that the writers would not stage another live news event with a controversial figure. The chalkboard gag is, in some ways, the show's smallest and most reliable canvas for self-awareness. It is the place where the show speaks directly to the audience, week after week, without breaking the frame of any individual episode. It is, in its way, the show's quietest piece of architecture, and it has continued, more or less unchanged, for the entire run of the series. The chalkboard is, in some sense, the show's signature. Every week, Bart writes something. Every week, the audience reads it. The line is, by definition, a kind of pact between the show and its viewers. We are still here. We are still doing this. We are still finding new things to say, even if they are only one sentence long. And there is the question of what comes after. The show, as of now, has been renewed for additional seasons. The voice cast, with some exceptions, remains in place. The writers continue to write. The animation continues to be produced. The episodes continue to air. There is no public plan for an ending. There is no rumor of a final episode. There is no creative team currently signaling that they want to wrap things up. The conspiracy is that the show simply does not end. The show continues. The show is, in the strict sense, designed to continue. Until the network changes its mind, until the voice cast can no longer record, until the audience finally drifts away, until some external event forces the matter, the show will continue. And given how durable the show has been to date, the moment at which any of those things will force the matter is impossible to predict. The show could end next year. The show could continue for another decade. The show could outlive everyone who has worked on it. The show is, by its own design, larger than the people who make it. There is one more thread worth pulling, because it touches on something that runs underneath everything else we have looked at tonight. And it is the question of what the show has, across its long life, actually been about. Not what it has parodied, not what it has predicted, not what it has shown. What it has, at its center, been arguing. The argument, if you watch the early seasons closely, is a recognizable one. It is a soft, half-angry, half-tender argument about the difficulty of being an ordinary family in an extraordinary country. The argument is that the institutions of American life, the schools, the churches, the workplaces, the police, the press, the political class, are mostly indifferent to ordinary families, and that the work of holding a family together, in spite of those institutions, is the real heroism of ordinary life. That is not a small argument, it is a serious argument. And it is, in different forms, the argument the show has been making over and over for almost 4 decades. The conspiracy, in its tenderest form, is that this argument has continued in episodes that, on the surface, no longer look like serious arguments. The show, in its later seasons, has often been accused of softness. It has often been accused of doing parody for parody's sake. It has often been accused of repeating itself. But underneath the repetitions, the argument continues. The family comes home. The family stays together. The institutions remain indifferent. The institutions are mocked. The mocking does not change the institutions. And the family, despite everything, makes dinner, sits at the table, fights, forgives, sleeps, and wakes up to do it again. That is, in the larger view, what the show has been recording, decade after decade, episode after episode. The persistence of ordinary love against indifferent institutions. The conspiracy is that this argument has been all along the show's deepest project, and that the audience, by being entertained, has been receiving the argument without quite noticing. We are pulling the threads together now, because we are at the end of what can be said in a single sitting about a show that has been on the air for almost 40 years. The conspiracy, in its largest form, has the following shape. The show is too big to be fully described. The show is too long to be fully watched. The show is too embedded in the culture to be fully separated from it. The show has, by its sheer accumulation, become a piece of the medium it exists inside. The way certain very old buildings become a piece of the neighborhood they sit in, the way certain very old people become a piece of the family they live with. The show, in this state, is no longer judged by individual episodes. It is judged by its continued presence. And that presence is, for many viewers, a kind of comfort that does not require active attention. The predictions on this reading are not the heart of the conspiracy. They are the surface of it. The Trump line in Bart to the Future is real, and it is a joke, and it is not a prophecy. The Disney billboard in 1998 is real, and it is industry observation, and it is not a prophecy. The smartwatch gag is real, and it is futurism, and it is not a prophecy. The dozens of fake predictions, the Ebola Tom Hanks image, the coronavirus screenshot, the various doctored frames that circulate every few months are not real. They are fan-made, and they should be treated as fan-made. The show is not, in any literal sense, predicting anything. The show is paying attention. The audience, by reading attention as prophecy, is participating in the conspiracy. The participation is part of why the conspiracy continues. The retcons on this reading are not failures. They are features. The principal and the pauper is the most honest moment in the show's relationship with its own canon. The canon has always been flexible. The Simpsons has never committed to a single timeline, a single geography, a single biography for any of its characters. The flexibility is part of the show's structural genius. It has allowed the show to keep telling stories for 40 years in a way that a tightly canonical show could not have. The retcon is the show's secret weapon, and the show, by using it openly, has revealed that it knows that the removed and edited episodes on this reading are the show's reckoning with its own history. Stark Raving Dad, in its absence, is a piece of evidence that the show is willing to edit its own past in light of present evidence. The episodes that were pulled around September 11th and then restored are evidence that the show is willing to pause and then resume. The Apu storyline is evidence that the show is willing to admit that some of its earlier choices were not, in retrospect, sustainable. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a show that is, in its own quiet way, capable of self-correction. Whether you agree with each specific correction or not, the existence of the correction process is itself remarkable for a show this old. The voice cast on this reading is the show's central miracle. A small group of actors has held a single set of voices steady for almost 40 years. The few losses, the few replacements, the few recastings have been handled with care. The continuity of the voices is what makes the show feel, despite everything, like the same show. The yellow palette is what makes it visible. The voices are what make it familiar. Without either, the show would not survive. With both, the show has, against the odds, continued. And the show itself, the actual product, the actual episodes, the actual half hours that air and are uploaded and are watched in living rooms across the world are not, on this reading, a conspiracy in any malicious sense. They are a ritual. They are a patient, repetitive, recognizable ritual that has held its shape across decades of cultural change. The opening credits change in small ways. The chalkboard gag changes every week. The couch gag changes every week. The episode changes every week. But the shape of the half hour, the rhythm of the storytelling, the sound of the voices, the color of the family, all of that has stayed roughly the same since 1989. The shape is the show. The shape is the conspiracy. The shape is what the audience has all along been returning to. Before we close this out, there are a handful of smaller threads that have grown up around the show in the last decade or so, and they are worth a brief, careful walkthrough because each of them is the kind of theory that gets repeated online without ever quite being checked. There is the theory that the various Treehouse of Horror segments form a single connected universe in which the Simpsons of the regular show are dreaming the segments. The theory has appeal. It explains why the segments are so internally consistent in tone, why the same set of supporting characters recurs across them, why the writers seem to enjoy returning to them, but the show has never confirmed it. The producers, in interviews, have consistently described the Treehouse of Horror as a non-canonical anthology, a yearly chance to play with story shapes that the regular show could not accommodate. The theory of a connected universe is interpretation. The producer statements are documentation. The two readings can sit side by side, but only one of them is what the show actually says about itself. There is the theory that the show has, at various points, foreshadowed the deaths of real public figures. We have already touched on the most extreme version of this, which is the prediction conspiracy. But there is a quieter variant in which fans claim that the show, by featuring particular guest stars in particular episodes, has somehow contributed to or signaled their later misfortunes. This is not a serious claim. It is a pattern the human eye finds, because the show has had so many guest stars across so many years that, statistically, some of them will, in the years after their appearance, encounter difficulty. The relationship is statistical, not causal. The show does not select its guest stars based on the future. It selects them based on who is famous in the year the episode is being made. Any later coincidence is a coincidence. We can say this clearly because the alternative is to assert a kind of magical thinking that the show itself does not endorse. There is the theory, which has its own small enduring life online, that one of the writers in the early room of The Simpsons had access to inside information about future political events, and that this writer, sometimes named in fan forums as one specific person, sometimes left vague, encoded that information into the early episodes. This theory has no documentary support. The writers' identities are public. Their biographies are public. The episodes they wrote are public. None of them held positions that would have given them future political information. The theory survives because it offers a clean explanation for a messy phenomenon. The cleaner explanation is that the writers, like any well-read writers, paid attention to the news, and wrote about things that were already developing. The theory survives because it offers more drama than the truth. The truth, as is often the case, is more boring than the conspiracy. But the truth is also, on the evidence, what is actually there. There is the theory about Maggie. The theory is that Maggie, the baby of the family, who has never aged in canon, who almost never speaks, who is, in many of the show's flash forwards, eventually given a future, is somehow the most important character in the show. The theory points to her involvement in the Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline. The theory points to her moments of unspoken intelligence, when she beats various adults at chess or solves problems through her pacifier. The theory points to the future episode in which she has become a famous musician. The theory points to the very first short on Tracey Ullman, in which Maggie is already part of the family. The theory is, in some forms, that Maggie is the secret protagonist of the entire show, the one whose long-term arc is, in some hidden sense, what the show is really tracking. The reading of the Maggie theory is, again, that the show has never confirmed it. The show is not on the evidence of any single episode, building a Maggie-centered narrative. But the theory persists because Maggie, by being the smallest and quietest member of the family, has accumulated, across decades of small moments, a kind of unspoken weight. She is the one who, in the opening credits, is scanned at the supermarket checkout. She is the one who, in the family car, is buckled into the back. She is the one who, when something needs to happen quietly, makes it happen. She is, in some quiet way, the most consistently underestimated character in Springfield. And the show, by repeatedly letting her quietly outsmart the adults, has made a small running argument about the cost of underestimating her. The argument is not foregrounded, it is in the corners, but it is there, and it is, in its own way, one of the most charming pieces of the show's long-running architecture. There is the theory about the sea captain. The character, a recurring sea captain named Horatio McAllister, has appeared in dozens of episodes, sometimes for a single line, sometimes as a small plot element. The theory is that the sea captain is somehow connected to a darker version of Springfield that the show only occasionally glimpses. The theory has no documentary support. It is, in the most generous reading, a fan invention. The sea captain is a recurring side character, used for nautical jokes, voiced by Hank Azaria, and given small moments of depth in a handful of episodes. He is not a coded reference to anything, but the theory, like many fan theories, is enjoyable to read, and the persistence of it tells you something about how the show invites that kind of reading. The town has so many characters. The characters have so many appearances. The audience, watching for long enough, begins to see hidden connections. Most of the connections are not really there. Some of them, in the show's own quiet design, are: there is the theory about the Simpsons house, the famous yellow and pink two-story home at 742 Evergreen Terrace. The theory is that the house, in its layout, is somehow impossible, that the rooms do not connect in any consistent way, that the basement is sometimes a fully realized workshop and sometimes a flooded swamp, that the attic is sometimes a finished bedroom and sometimes a cobweb storage space, that the house, viewed across hundreds of episodes, is structurally a contradiction. This theory is, in a strict sense, true. The house does change across episodes. The animators, episode to episode, have not always drawn the same interior. The rooms have shifted, the layouts have varied, but this is not, on closer inspection, a conspiracy. It is the standard freedom of long-running animation, in which the production needs of any given episode override the strict geometric consistency of the set. The house, like the town, like the family, like the entire show, has been allowed to float. It is not a single house. It is a series of houses that share an exterior. That is, in its own way, part of the show's structural philosophy. The fixed surface, the floating interior, the recognizable shape, the flexible content. There is the theory about the chalkboard messages themselves. Some fans, watching across many seasons, have argued that the chalkboard messages, taken in sequence, encode a hidden message about the writer's state of mind, about the show's relationship to its own audience, about cultural events of any given week. The theory, as a whole, is overreach. The chalkboard messages are written by individual writers, on individual episodes. often as throwaway gags. They are not, on the evidence, a coordinated long-term coded communication. But some of them are, in their own moments, beautifully expressive. There's a chalkboard message that simply states that the show will not air a particular kind of joke again. There is a chalkboard message that openly references a previous controversial episode and quietly comments on it. There is a chalkboard message that simply says, in some form, that the writers love the audience. These messages are not coded, they are public, and they are, in their accumulation, one of the most charming features of the show's relationship with its viewers. The chalkboard is the show, in a very small space, talking to the audience. Sometimes it is a joke, sometimes it is a confession, sometimes it is just a sentence. But the practice has continued, week after week, for almost 4 decades. And the practice itself is one of the show's quiet kindnesses to the people who have stayed with it. The story of the Simpsons conspiracy is not the story of secrets being kept. It is the story of patterns being repeated. The patterns are visible. The repetitions are deliberate. The audience, by watching for long enough, becomes part of the patterns themselves. That is the deepest piece of the conspiracy, and it is the piece that almost nobody talks about. The conspiracy is not happening to the audience. The audience is, by watching, participating in it. The show is the conspiracy. The viewer is the conspirator. Together, we have been building, for almost 40 years, a single, long, ongoing performance. And that performance has, in its own way, become one of the most enduring pieces of shared American imagination of our lifetime. That is, in the end, what the show is. A shared imagination. A yellow imagination. A small town that does not exist, lived in by a family that does not age, written by a room that keeps rotating, voiced by actors who keep returning, watched by viewers who keep coming back. The conspiracy is the continuity. The continuity is the conspiracy. There is no secret villain. There is no hidden room. There is no signed contract with the future. There is only a long, calm, patient piece of work made by people who have, for the most part, loved making it, and watched by people who have, for the most part, loved watching it. The work continues. The watching continues. The pattern continues. And, on most nights, that is enough. So this is where we will leave it, with the family on the couch, and the chalkboard still being written, and the town still floating somewhere on a map that no one has finished drawing. The Simpsons, in its current state, is no longer the cultural force it was in the early 1990s. But it is something almost stranger than that. It is a kind of inheritance, a long, quiet present from one generation of viewers to the next. The early audience watched it as new. The later audiences receive it as found. The find is real. The inheritance is real. And the next time you happen on the show, on some lazy afternoon, with the credits rolling and the couch filling and the chalkboard already half written, you will be picking up something that hundreds of millions of people have, at different points in their lives, picked up before you. You will be part of a long, quiet ritual that has, against the odds, kept going. For me, what I find most worth holding on to in all of this is the simple fact that the show has remained, across decades of cultural noise, recognizably itself. The family is still on the couch. The town is still somewhere unmapped. The chalkboard is still being written. The voices are mostly the same. The colors are still that particular saturated yellow, unmistakable from any distance. In a culture that has, in our lifetimes, changed almost everything about how we watch and how we share and how we remember, the Simpsons family has stayed where they were. They are, in some quiet way, one of the few stable things we have. Their stability is not a small thing. Their stability is, in fact, a kind of gift. The conspiracy, at its kindest reading, is that the show has been quietly giving us that gift for almost 40 years. The gift is presence. The gift is continuity. The gift is the unchanging yellow family, sitting on the unchanging couch, in the unchanging town that does not exist. And the gift is still being given. Thank you for staying with me through this. Thank you for choosing this for tonight. Thank you for letting a story about a yellow family carry you down towards sleep. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.